Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into one of history's strangest contradictions, a time when women were told they were too delicate and fragile to work, too weak to think, too sensitive to handle the real world, and yet these same women were absolutely forbidden from ever being idle. Imagine being diagnosed with a medical condition called dangerous idleness, and locked away for the crime of sitting still. This actually happened. And tonight, we are going to explore how rest became a battleground for women's bodies, minds, and souls in Victorian society. Before we step into this strange world together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I share with you tonight. And I am always curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked into bed in New York listening while you wind down in California? Maybe you are on the other side of the world. Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one and it honestly makes my day. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let us drift back to a time when rest was anything but restful. Picture this. It is 1885 and you are a woman living in Victorian England or America. You have just finished breakfast, a small meal of course, because ladies must never appear too hungry. You're wearing a corset that has been laced so tightly that taking a full breath feels impossible. Your dress weighs about 15 pounds with all its layers, and now you face the great question of the day. What will you do with yourself? But here is the thing, you cannot do just anything. You cannot work, because working is for the lower classes and would bring shame to your husband or father. You cannot go out alone, because that would be scandalous. You cannot read just any book you like, because novels are considered dangerous for the female mind. You cannot engage in vigorous exercise, because doctors believe it will damage your reproductive organs. So what can you do? According to Victorian society, you must rest, and this is where it gets truly bizarre, you must never, ever be idle. Let that sink in for a moment. You must rest, but you must not be idle. You must be still, but you must always be productive. You must preserve your delicate health, but you must never appear lazy. It is a paradox that drove thousands of women to the edge of sanity. This idea did not come from nowhere. It was rooted in a belief that went back centuries, one that you have probably heard before. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. This phrase, while not appearing word for word in the Bible, was considered practically scripture in Victorian homes. The idea came from Proverbs and was popularized throughout Christian Europe. The belief that an unoccupied person, especially an unoccupied woman, would inevitably fall into sin and corruption. But what made the Victorian era unique was how this old religious idea merged with new medical science to create an elaborate system of control over women's bodies and time. Doctors, scientists, and social reformers all agreed women were simultaneously too fragile to handle any real responsibility, yet too dangerous to be left alone with their own thoughts. The medical establishment of the time had very specific beliefs about women's bodies. They believed that women had a finite amount of energy, and that this energy needed to be carefully conserved for their primary purpose, bearing children. Any energy spent on education, work, or intellectual pursuits would be stolen from the womb, potentially rendering a woman infertile or causing her children to be weak and sickly. This was not fringe science. This was published in medical journals, taught in universities, and used to justify keeping women out of higher education and professional work. In 1873, Dr. Edward Clark of Harvard Medical School published a book called Sex in Education, where he argued quite seriously that if women went to college, the blood would flow to their brains instead of their reproductive organs, causing their uteruses to atrophy. I know, take a moment with that one. So women were told to rest. to preserve their precious energy, to avoid strain and stress. But at the same time, they were warned about the moral dangers of idleness. An 1856 etiquette manual called The Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility, written by Emily Thornwell, put it plainly: a lady must always have her hands occupied with some useful work. To sit with empty hands was a sign of moral weakness, laziness, and poor character. Think about what this meant in practice. You could not work a job, but you could not be idle. You could not pursue a career, but you must always be productive. You could not make decisions about your own life, but you must fill every moment with purposeful activity. This created what I call productive rest, an oxymoron that perfectly captures the insanity of Victorian expectations. Women were expected to spend their days in a state of constant, exhausting, restful productivity. They would sit still for hours, hands flying with needle and thread, creating embroidery that no one needed, hemming handkerchiefs that no one would use, all to prove that they were virtuous women who did not waste time. Let me give you a real example. In 1870, a woman named Margaret Oliphant, a British writer, kept detailed diaries about her daily life. On one particular day, she wrote about feeling guilty because she had spent 30 minutes simply sitting and thinking, with no handwork to occupy her fingers. 30 minutes. She felt she had committed a moral failing by allowing herself half an hour of quiet thought. The pressure was relentless. Women internalized these rules so deeply that they could not relax, even in their own homes, even when alone. The voice of society had become the voice in their heads, constantly asking, "Are you being useful? Are your hands occupied? What are you producing right now?" And if a woman pushed back, if she said she was tired or wanted to just sit and do nothing, there was a diagnosis waiting for her: neurasthenia. This was a medical term coined in the 1880s that basically meant nervous exhaustion. But here is the fascinating and horrifying part. The symptoms of neurasthenia included things like wanting to be alone, feeling tired, lacking interest in domestic duties, and desiring intellectual stimulation. In other words, if you were a woman who was exhausted from constant productivity and wanted actual rest, you were diagnosed as sick. The treatment for this sickness? Well, we will get into the full horror of the rest cure in a later part of our story, but for now, know this. The medical establishment's solution to women being tired from never resting was to force them into an even more controlled, even more restrictive form of not resting. It would be funny if it were not so cruel, but what makes this entire system even more maddening is the class divide. While upper and middle class women were being told they were too delicate to work but must never be idle, working class women were labouring in factories for 16 hours a day. Poor women were scrubbing floors, hauling water, washing clothes by hand until their fingers bled. And no one was worried about their delicate constitutions or their need for rest. The rules about rest and idleness were not really about health or morality. They were about control. They were about keeping a certain class of women decorative, dependent, and confined to the home. A woman who was always busy with handwork was a woman who was not reading radical ideas, not organizing with other women, not questioning why she had no legal rights to her own property or children. The tragedy is that many women believed it. They believed they were fragile. They believed that idleness was sinful. They believed that their value came from their constant visible productivity, even if that productivity was completely meaningless in any practical sense. I think about this sometimes in our modern world, where we glorify being busy, where we feel guilty about taking breaks, where we call relaxation self-care, as if caring for ourselves requires justification. We may not be embroidering handkerchiefs anymore, but how many of us feel uncomfortable sitting still? How many of us cannot watch television without also scrolling on our phones, or cannot take a bath without listening to a podcast, or cannot go for a walk without tracking our steps? The Victorian obsession with proactive rest is not as far behind us as we might like to think. But here is what I find most powerful about this history. Women resisted. Even in the face of medical authority, social pressure and legal restrictions, women found ways to carve out actual rest for themselves. They hid novels inside their embroidery baskets. They daydreamed while their needles moved on autopilot. They formed friendships with other women and found solidarity in shared frustration, and eventually they organized, they fought back, and they changed the world. As we continue through this series, we're going to explore all the different ways Victorian society tried to control women's rest. From the needlework trap to the reading restrictions, from the horrifying rest cure to the rules about posture, conversation, and even sleep. We are going to see the absurdity, the cruelty, and yes, sometimes the dark humour in these rules. But we are also going to see the resilience of the women who lived through this. And maybe, just maybe, we will find some wisdom for our own lives about what real rest actually means. So take a deep breath, let your hands be still for a moment, and join me as we uncover the funny, sad, and ultimately inspiring story of when women were never allowed to be idle. In our next part, we are going to dive into the needlework trap, the way women were forced to spend 4, 5, 6 hours a day with needle and thread, all in the name of rest. You're not going to believe some of the rules and expectations, but for now, let yourself drift, let yourself rest, the real kind of rest, the kind Victorian women were denied. I will be here when you are ready to continue the story. Good night for now, and remember, sometimes doing nothing is the most radical thing you can do. So now we understand the impossible paradox Victorian women faced. They had to rest, but they could never be idle. And nowhere was this contradiction more visible, more physically demanding, and frankly more absurd than in the world of needlework. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical day looked like for a middle-class Victorian woman. After breakfast, she would retire to the drawing room or parlour. She would settle herself into a chair. Back perfectly straight, remember. Slouching was unacceptable even during rest time. And then she would pick up her embroidery hoop, her knitting needles, or her sewing basket. And for the next 4 to 6 hours, with only brief interruptions for lunch or receiving visitors, her hands would move continuously, stitch after stitch after stitch, 4 to 6 hours, every single day. This was not optional, this was expected. This was how a lady proved her virtue. Now you might be thinking, well, at least they were creating useful things, right? Clothes for the family, linens for the home. Actually, no. That is where this gets really interesting and honestly, kind of heartbreaking. Victorian needlework was divided into 2 distinct categories, and understanding this division is key to understanding the whole system. There was plain work, and there was fancy work. Plain work was the practical stuff, mending tiers, hemming sheets, sewing undergarments. This was the work that actually needed to be done, and in middle-class and upper-class homes, this work was done by servants or hired seamstresses. The lady of the house, she did fancy work, decorative embroidery, ornamental crochet, elaborate lace making. She would spend hours and hours creating doilies that no one needed, embroidering flowers on handkerchiefs that were too beautiful to actually use, crocheting antimacassars for furniture that already had perfectly good fabric. An 1873 issue of Harper's Bazaar actually described this as the frivolity of fancy work. Even the magazines of the time acknowledged that what these women were doing was essentially pointless. But it was required pointless work, because it proved something very specific. It proved that a husband could afford to keep a wife who did not need to do real labour. Think about that for a moment. A woman's needlework was not about creating useful items, it was about displaying her husband's wealth and status. Her constantly moving hands were a performance, a visible proof that she had leisure time, but could never actually be at leisure. The historian Mimi Matthews, who specialises in Victorian social history, found records showing that middle-class women typically spent between 4 to 6 hours per day on needlework. But for some women, especially those trying to climb the social ladder or prove their respectability, it could be even more. Some diaries mention 8 or 9 hours of stitching in a single day. Can you imagine sitting in one position for 8 hours, your fingers moving in tiny repetitive motions, your eyes straining over the vine stitches, creating something that has no practical purpose whatsoever? It sounds less like rest and more like, well, like a job, a tedious, unpaid, physically damaging job, because yes, it was physically damaging. We have medical records from the Victorian era documenting what doctors called seamstress finger, a condition involving swollen joints, nerve pain, and reduced flexibility from repetitive stitching motions. We have accounts of women developing severe eye strain, chronic headaches, and spinal problems from hours of bending over their work. One British physician in 1889 wrote about treating middle-class women for what we would now recognise as carpal tunnel syndrome. He noted rather dryly that these women were suffering from the occupational hazards of leisure, that even the doctors could see the irony, even if they did not do anything to change the system. But here is what I find most fascinating about the needlework trap. It was not just about keeping women's hands busy, it was about keeping their minds controlled. When your concentration is focused on counting stitches, on following a pattern, on not making mistakes that would need to be unpicked and redone, you do not have mental energy left for dangerous thoughts. You do not have time to wonder why you cannot vote or own property or keep your own earnings if you do work. Emily Thornwell, in her 1856 etiquette guide, The Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility, was quite explicit about this. She wrote that needlework was essential for training young women in habits of useful industry and for occupying the mind in ways that prevent idleness and improper thoughts. Needlework was supposed to make you virtuous by keeping you too busy to be anything else, and society enforced this relentlessly. If you were visiting someone's home and you arrived to find the lady of the house sitting with empty hands, just sitting and thinking or looking out the window, or reading without doing handwork at the same time, it was considered shocking. It was something people would gossip about. Did you hear about Mrs. So-and-so? I called on her Tuesday afternoon and she was simply sitting there doing nothing at all. The shame of empty hands was real and powerful. Women internalized it so deeply that many literally could not sit still without feeling anxious and guilty. We have diary entries from women describing how uncomfortable they felt, how wrong it seemed to sit without handwork even when they were exhausted or ill. But the class dynamics of all this make it even more infuriating. While wealthy ladies were doing 6 hours of decorative embroidery to prove they did not need to work, actual working-class seamstresses were labouring in horrific conditions. These were the women doing the plain work for pay, and they were suffering terribly. In 1843, the British government's second report of the Children's Employment Commission exposed the brutal reality of professional needlework. Women were working 14 to 16-hour days in dark, cramped garrets, paid pennies for work that destroyed their eyesight, their health. Many died young from tuberculosis, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Some, desperate and starving, turned to prostitution to survive. Thomas Hood's famous poem Song of the Shirt, published in 1843, captured the public's horror at these conditions. It tells the story of a seamstress stitching in poverty and despair. The poem was a sensation, reprinted everywhere. and people were genuinely shocked and moved by the plight of these working women. But here is the thing that no one seemed to notice. The same society that was horrified by professional seamstresses working themselves to death was perfectly comfortable with ladies spending 6 hours a day doing essentially the same motions, just unpaid and for no practical purpose. The difference was not the work itself. The difference was the class of the woman doing it. If you were poor, needlework was exploitative labour that destroyed you. If you were wealthy, needlework was virtuous leisure that proved your refinement. The same activity, the same physical toll on the body, but completely different social meanings. And there were rules about the needlework itself, of course, because everything in Victorian society had rules. Godey's Ladies' Book, the most popular women's magazine of the era, published detailed instructions not just for stitching techniques, but for proper needlework behaviour. How to hold your hands, how to position your work, what to say if someone complimented your stitching, how to graciously accept criticism if your work was imperfect. In 1861, in the famous Household Management Guide, Beeton's Book of Household Management noted that light or fancy needlework often forms a portion of the evening's recreation for the ladies of the household. Recreation. They called it recreation, as if spending your evening stitching tiny flowers onto linen you already owned was somehow fun and relaxing after spending your afternoon doing the exact same thing. Although, I will say this. For some women, needlework did become a genuine escape. Not because they loved the stitching itself, but because it was one of the few times they could let their minds wander without being interrupted or questioned. If your hands were busy with acceptable work, people left you alone. You could sit in a room full of people and be entirely in your own thoughts, daydreaming, planning, imagining different lives. The author Dinah Mullock-Craik wrote in 1858 about women who use needlework this way, describing them as using their needles to prick old time to death, filling endless empty hours with something that looked productive but allowed for mental freedom. Some women embroidered entire fantasies into their work, creating beautiful, intricate pieces that told stories no one else could read. And there is something quite powerful about that, actually. These women were trapped in a system designed to control them, but they found small rebellions, tiny freedoms within the constraints. Their hands followed the rules, but their minds roamed free. Still, we cannot romanticize this too much. The physical and mental toll was real. Imagine if I told you that starting right now, you had to spend 4 to 6 hours every single day doing repetitive hand motions to create objects you did not need and did not want, just to prove you were a good person. You would think I was describing some kind of punishment, right? Some kind of torture designed to break your spirit? That was just called being a lady in Victorian society. The needlework trap was genius in its cruelty because it looked so harmless. It looked like women choosing to spend their time on a gentle, feminine hobby. But it was mandatory. It was enforced through social pressure, shame, and the constant surveillance of other women. And it served a clear purpose: keeping women occupied, keeping the decorative, keeping them too busy and too tired to demand more from life. So the next time you see a beautiful piece of Victorian embroidery in a museum, or an antique sampler in someone's home, I want you to think about the hands that made it. Think about the hours spent in stillness that was not rest, in productivity that was not meaningful, in leisure that was actually labour. And maybe think about the ways we still do this to ourselves. The ways we cannot just sit and be. The ways we feel guilty about rest unless we are also being productive somehow. The ways we turn even our hobbies into obligations, our relaxation into performance. In our next part, we are going to explore another way Victorian society controlled women's rest, through reading restrictions, because apparently having your hands constantly busy was not enough. They also needed to control what you put into your mind. And wait until you hear what happened to women who dared to read the wrong kind of books. But that is coming up next. For now, let your hands rest, let them be still and empty. I promise the world will not end if you do nothing for a few moments. We have talked about how Victorian women had to keep their hands constantly busy, but their minds, well, those needed even more careful supervision. Because in the Victorian imagination, a woman's mind was a delicate, dangerous thing, easily corrupted, prone to overheating, and absolutely, positively not equipped to handle certain kinds of stories. I want you to imagine settling into your favourite reading spot right now. Maybe you have a novel on your nightstand or a book app on your phone. You can read whatever you want. Romance, mystery, science fiction, literary fiction, whatever calls to you. Now imagine that someone, a doctor, a minister, your father or husband, told you that reading those stories was making you sick, that novels were literally poisoning your mind and destroying your health, and that for your own good, during your rest time, you could only read approved books from a very specific list. This was reality for Victorian women. And the approved reading list? It was about as exciting as watching paint dry. The Moral Encyclopedia, a popular Victorian guidebook for proper behaviour, laid it out plainly. Read no novels, but let your study be history, geography, biography, and other instructive books. Notice what is missing from that list. Stories, imagination, anything that might make you feel something other than educational improvement. This was not just one random book's opinion. This was echoed across dozens of etiquette manuals, medical journals, and advice columns throughout the Victorian era. Novels were considered dangerous, especially for women, and during rest time, those precious hours when a woman was supposed to be recovering her delicate strength, novel reading was absolutely forbidden. But why? What was so terrifying about a woman reading a novel while doing her embroidery? Well, the Victorians had very specific theories about this, and honestly, they are kind of hilarious in retrospect. Doctors believed that reading fiction caused what they called nervous excitement. The plot twists, the emotional drama, the romantic storylines, all of this was thought to overstimulate the female brain, which was considered fundamentally weaker and more susceptible to agitation than the male brain. In 1856, the same year Emily Thornwell published her Etiquette Guide, a physician named William Acton wrote that novel reading in women could lead to inappropriate desires and nervous disorders. He genuinely believed that reading about romance, even chaste Victorian romance, could cause a woman's reproductive system to malfunction. I'm not making this up. These were respected medical professionals publishing this in actual medical journals. There was a real moral panic about novels. Ministers preached against them from pulpits. Mothers confiscated them from daughters. Husbands monitored what their wives were reading. One popular religious tract from the 1860s warned that novel reading was the first step on the road to ruin for young women, suggesting that it would lead to everything from laziness to promiscuity to complete mental breakdown. The concern was not just about the content of the novels, although that was part of it. It was about the act of reading itself. Reading a novel required imagination. It required putting yourself in someone else's shoes, experiencing their emotions, their desires, their rebellions. And Victorian society was deeply uncomfortable with women doing that kind of mental work. Because here is what they really feared. They feared that a woman reading about a heroine who defied convention might start to wonder why she could not do the same. They feared that a woman reading about passionate love might realize her own marriage was cold and empty. They feared that a woman experiencing adventure through books might start to resent the tiny, controlled world she was confined to. So instead, women were directed toward improving literature. Biographies of great men, Historical accounts of wars and politics, geography books describing places women would never be allowed to visit, religious texts emphasizing obedience and submission. These were considered safe because they did not encourage imagination or emotion. But here is the truly twisted part. This was all framed as concern for women's health during rest time. The medical establishment genuinely argued that reading novels was too mentally taxing for women's rest periods. They claimed it would exhaust the nervous system, cause insomnia, bring on headaches, and even damage a woman's ability to bear healthy children. Dr. George Beard, who coined the term neurasthenia that we talked about earlier, specifically listed novel reading as one of the causes of nervous exhaustion in women. He recommended that women experiencing fatigue or melancholy should avoid all fiction and stick to light, factual reading only. Let me just point out the irony here. These same doctors had no problem with women spending 6 hours a day doing eye-straining needlework. That was fine, apparently. But reading a story for an hour? Dangerously overstimulating. Of course, like every restrictive rule in history, this one had a massive loophole depending on your gender. Men could read whatever they wanted. Men were encouraged to read widely, including novels, including French novels, which were often quite risque by Victorian standards. The male brain was considered robust enough to handle fiction without ill effects. But women? No. Too delicate, too impressionable, too likely to get confused between fiction and reality. Now, do you think women actually followed these rules? Of course not. Well, some did, the ones who had fully internalized these beliefs. But many women became experts at reading rebellion. They hid novels inside the covers of approved books. They borrowed books from circulating libraries and read them in secret. They passed forbidden novels among friends like contraband. The novelist Charlotte Bronte, before she became famous, wrote about this in her novel Shirley, published in 1849. One of her characters describes how women would hide novels inside their embroidery baskets, reading a page or two whenever they could steal a moment unobserved. The needle would be in one hand, ready to be picked up the instant someone walked in, while the other hand turned pages. Libraries were sites of both opportunity and surveillance. Circulating libraries, which rented books for a small fee, became incredibly popular in the Victorian era. For many middle-class women, these libraries were their only access to current fiction. But librarians often kept track of what women were borrowing, and there are records of librarians refusing to lend certain novels to female customers, or even reporting a woman's reading choices to her husband or father if they seemed inappropriate. Imagine going to the library and having the librarian say, "I am sorry, but I cannot lend you that book without your husband's permission." That actually happened. Regularly. The books that were considered most dangerous? Well, anything with romance, obviously, anything with adventure, anything where women characters made their own choices or challenged authority. Gothic novels were particularly suspect. All those mysterious castles and dark secrets and women in peril. Sensation novels, which were wildly popular in the 1860s, were considered especially corrupting because they dealt with crime, adultery, and social transgression. One of the most controversial books of the Victorian era was Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, published in 1862. It is about a beautiful woman with a dark past who commits various crimes to protect her secrets. The book was a massive bestseller, which tells you that despite all the hand-wringing about what women should read, women were buying and reading exactly what they wanted. But the criticism of this book was fierce. Critics called it immoral and unwholesome. They worried it would give women dangerous ideas. One reviewer wrote that it was one of the most noxious books of modern times, and worried about its effect on the minds of English girls. What were these dangerous ideas exactly? Well, the heroine of Lady Audley's Secret is not passive. She takes action, even criminal action, to control her own fate. She refuses to accept the role society has assigned her, and that apparently was too radical for young women to be reading about. The best-selling status of these dangerous novels, despite all the warnings against them, reveals something important. Women were hungry for stories that reflected their own frustrations, their own desires for agency and adventure. Reading became an act of quiet resistance. And some women went further than quiet resistance. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, all wrote novels that challenged Victorian assumptions about women. They published under male pseudonyms at first because they knew their work would not be taken seriously if readers knew women had written it. Emily's Wuthering Heights was called coarse and brutal. Charlotte's Jane Eyre was criticised for being too passionate, too rebellious. But women read these books anyway. They passed them hand to hand. They stayed up late by candlelight to finish them. They wept over them, thrilled to them, saw themselves reflected in these heroines who refused to accept limitation. There is a beautiful bit of revenge in the fact that these dangerous novels are now considered classics of English literature, studied in universities, revered as artistic achievements. The very books Victorian authorities tried to keep out of women's hands are now the ones we celebrate as capturing the truth of that era. But back in the moment, for the individual woman sitting in her drawing room, trying to steal a few moments of the imaginative escape during her mandated rest time, the consequences could be real. We have diary entries from women describing the guilt they felt about reading novels, the fear of being caught, the shame when a book was discovered and confiscated. One woman wrote in 1871 about how her husband found a novel hidden in her room and burned it in the fireplace while lecturing her about corrupting her mind. She described feeling humiliated and angry but powerless to protest. The next week, she wrote, she borrowed another novel from a friend and hid it even more carefully. The psychological impact of all this cannot be overstated. Imagine being told your entire life that your own thoughts and feelings cannot be trusted, that you need external authorities, doctors, ministers, fathers, husbands, to tell you what is safe for you to put into your mind, that your imagination itself is a kind of illness that needs to be controlled. This is thought control dressed up as health concern, and it worked on many women. They internalized the belief that their minds were weak, that imagination was dangerous, that they needed protection from their own thoughts. But it did not work on everyone, and that is what gives me hope when I study this history. Despite all the pressure, despite the medical authority and social shame and legal powerlessness, women kept reading, they kept thinking, they kept imagining different worlds and different possibilities. The reading restrictions during rest time were about more than just controlling content. They were about controlling consciousness itself. A woman reading approved text would absorb the lessons Victorian society wanted her to learn. Obedience, submission, acceptance of her limited role. A woman reading novels might start to question everything, and questions, in a society built on rigid hierarchy and control, are always dangerous. So the next time you pick up a book, any book you choose, whenever you choose, wherever you choose, take a moment to appreciate that freedom. Appreciate that no one is monitoring what you read, that no one is confiscating your books, that you can lose yourself in any story that calls to you without fear or shame. That freedom was fought for by women who read in secret, who hid books, who shared them despite the risk, who refused to let anyone else decide what they were allowed to think and feel and imagine. Coming up next, we are going to dive into perhaps the darkest chapter of Victorian rest control, the rest cure itself, the medical treatment that took all these ideas about women's delicate minds and fragile bodies and turned them into a systematic torture disguised as healing. It is a horrifying story, but an important one, and I think you will be shocked by just how recently these practices were still happening. But we will get to that shortly. For now, Rest your mind. Read what you want. Think your own thoughts. No one can take that from you anymore. There comes a moment in every oppressive system where the contradictions become so extreme, so unbearable that they break people. For Victorian women, that breaking point often came quietly. A persistent sadness, a bone-deep exhaustion, a feeling that something was terribly wrong even though society insisted everything was exactly as it should be. And when women showed these signs of breaking, the medical establishment had a solution ready. They called it the rest cure, and it remains one of the most chilling examples of how care can become control, how treatment can become trauma. Let me tell you about a doctor named Silas Weir Mitchell. He was not some quack operating on the fringes of medicine. He was one of the most respected neurologists in America in the late 1800s. He had worked with Civil War veterans, studying nerve injuries and pain disorders. He had made genuine contributions to medical science. And then, in the 1880s, he turned his attention to what he called nervous women. The treatment he developed would be prescribed to thousands of women over the next several decades. Some would credit it with saving their lives. Others would say it drove them to madness. The rest cure was designed to treat neurasthenia, that catch-all diagnosis we have talked about. Remember, neurasthenia supposedly included symptoms like depression, anxiety, insomnia, headaches and fatigue. But it also included things like wanting intellectual stimulation, desiring independence, and showing too much interest in activities outside the home. In other words, it was often diagnosed in women who were unhappy with their restricted lives. Dr. Mitchell believed he had identified the root cause of neurasthenia in women. According to his theory, the problem was that modern women were using up their limited nerve force on mental activities, education, reading, socializing, even worrying too much. This depletion of nerve force irritated the brain, digestive organs, and reproductive system. The solution? Complete rest. Complete isolation, complete removal of all mental stimulation for 6 to 8 weeks. On paper, that might sound almost reasonable. If someone is exhausted, surely rest would help, right? But the reality of the rest cure was nothing like what we would call rest. It was something else entirely. Here is what the treatment actually involved. A woman would be confined to bed, not just encouraged to lie down, but absolutely forbidden from sitting up or standing. She could not get out of bed to use the bathroom. She had to use a bedpan assisted by nurses. She could not feed herself. Food was brought to her, and she was fed like an infant, or in some cases force-fed if she was reluctant to eat. She was not allowed to read, not allowed to write, not allowed to do any handwork like sewing or embroidery, not allowed to have visitors, not allowed to talk to the nurses except to communicate basic needs. Some doctors even limited how much patients could speak at all, believing that conversation itself was too stimulating. The patient was completely isolated, sometimes in a darkened room, for 6 to 8 weeks. Can you imagine lying in bed, alone, with literally nothing to do, no one to talk to, no books to read, no work to occupy your hands for 2 months straight? What would that do to your mind? But it gets worse. The rest cure also involved forced weight gain. Dr. Mitchell believed that plump women were healthier and more mentally stable than thin women, so his patients were put on a diet heavy in milk, cream, and fatty meats. The goal was to gain 40 to 50 pounds during the treatment period. One of Mitchell's own case studies, published in his 1807 book Fat and Blood, describes a patient who gained 50 pounds in 7 weeks. He presented this as a triumph, but read the patient's own account if you can find it, and you hear about the nausea, the discomfort, the psychological distress of being force-fed when you're not hungry, of watching your body change in ways you did not choose. The rest cure also included daily massage and electrotherapy. Now, massage might sound pleasant, But these were not relaxing spa massages. They were vigorous, sometimes painful manipulations meant to prevent muscle atrophy since the patients were not allowed to move. The electrotherapy involved applying electrical currents to various parts of the body, supposedly to stimulate the nerves. The sensations ranged from tingling to genuinely painful shocks. Dr. Mitchell himself described the treatment as intentionally unpleasant. He wrote that the cure needed to be disagreeable enough to make patients willing to get well and leave the physician's care. Think about that logic for a moment. He made the treatment deliberately miserable so that women would be motivated to get better, but they were only allowed to get better by conforming to his ideas of proper feminine behavior. Because here is the thing about the rest cure. It was not just physical. It came with explicit instructions about how women should live after the treatment ended. Mitchell told his patients that once they were cured, they needed to devote themselves entirely to domestic duties. No reading except light magazines, no writing, no intellectual pursuits, no socializing that was not directly related to family obligations. Their nerve force needed to be conserved for wifehood and motherhood. In his book Doctor and Patient, published in 1888, Mitchell wrote quite openly that he saw overeducated, ambitious women as the primary victims of neurasthenia. He believed that women who pursued careers or intellectual interests were working against their nature, and that this conflict was making them sick. The rest cure, in his mind, was not just treating symptoms, it was correcting a fundamental life error. So women who emerged from the rest cure were expected to embrace limitation, to accept that their earlier ambitions had been the problem, to willingly confine themselves to domestic life, to productive rest with needle and thread, to reading only approved texts, to never questioning their circumscribed existence again. And here is what makes this truly sinister. For many women, the rest cure did provide relief, at least temporarily. After 8 weeks of sensory deprivation and enforced helplessness, the return to normal life, even a restricted normal life, felt like freedom. After being denied books, being allowed to read domestic magazines felt like a gift. After being forbidden from speaking, being allowed to make small talk felt liberating. The cure reset their baseline for what was tolerable, making them grateful for the very restrictions that had made them ill in the first place. It was psychological manipulation disguised as medical treatment, and it worked on a disturbingly large scale. Now, I need to tell you about the most famous critique of the rest cure, because it is both heartbreaking and powerful. In 1892, a writer named Charlotte Perkins Gilman published a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper. It is fiction, but it is based very closely on Gilman's own experience with Dr. Mitchell and the rest cure. In 1886, Gilman had just given birth to her first child. She fell into what we would now recognize as severe postpartum depression. She described feeling utter prostration and unbearable inner misery, crying constantly, unable to function. Her husband took her to see Dr. Mitchell, the most famous nerve specialist in the country. Mitchell prescribed the rest cure. For several weeks, Gilman was confined to bed isolated, forbidden from writing or reading or any creative work. Mitchell's final instructions to her, when she was released, were explicit. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours of intellectual life a day, and never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Never write again. For Gilman, who was a writer and thinker, this was like being told never to breathe again. She tried to follow his orders. She lasted 3 months. In her autobiography, written years later, she described it. I made a rag baby, hung it on a doorknob, and played with it. I crawled into closets and under beds. I could not read, could not write, could not paint. I made myself a costume and danced grotesquely in it. The mental agony grew so unbearable that I would sit blankly, moving my head from side to side. She was quite literally going insane from following the treatment. Finally, she rejected Mitchell's advice completely. She left her husband, moved across the country, began writing and working again, and slowly recovered her mental health. The rest cure had not healed her. It had nearly destroyed her. The yellow wallpaper is her revenge and her warning. In the story, a woman undergoing the rest cure becomes obsessed with the wallpaper in the room where she is confined. She begins to see a woman trapped behind the pattern, trying to escape. By the end of the story, she has completely lost her grip on reality, believing she herself is the woman in the wallpaper, creeping around the room's perimeter. It is a horror story, but the real horror is that it was published in 1892 and women were still being prescribed the rest cure for decades afterward. Gilman sent a copy of the story to Dr. Mitchell. He never responded to her, but years later she heard from a friend that he had changed his treatment methods slightly after reading it. Slightly. Not abandoned the rest cure, just made it slightly less severe. Virginia Woolf, the famous British writer, underwent multiple rest cures in the early 1900s. She hated every one of them and wrote scathingly about the experience. In her novel Mrs. Dalloway, one of the characters is a veteran suffering from trauma, and his doctors prescribe rest and isolation. The character eventually commits suicide. Woolf herself would struggle with mental illness her entire life, and she often said that the rest cures made her worse, not better. But here is something fascinating and infuriating. The rest cure was prescribed almost exclusively for women. Men suffering from neurasthenia were given completely different treatment. Dr. Mitchell himself recommended what he called the West cure for male patients. They were sent out west to ranches or wilderness areas where they engaged in vigorous outdoor activity, horseback riding, camping, physical exertion, fresh air, adventure, challenge, stimulation. Same diagnosis, same doctor. Completely opposite treatments based entirely on the patient's gender. Men were cured through activity and freedom. Women were cured through passivity and confinement. The message could not have been clearer. One of Mitchell's male patients was Theodore Roosevelt, who went west to recover from both asthma and what was described as nervous exhaustion. The treatment worked wonderfully for him. He gained strength, confidence, and a lifelong love of wilderness conservation. He became President of the United States. Meanwhile, Mitchell's female patients were lying in dark rooms, forbidden to move or think, gaining weight they did not want, being told their ambitions had made them sick. The rest cure was expensive. It required a private room, constant nursing care, special food preparation, and weeks or months of a doctor's time. So it was really only available to middle-class and upper-class women who could afford it, or whose families could afford it. Working-class women suffering from exhaustion and depression just had to keep working. They did not have the luxury of a rest cure, however miserable it might be. And that class division reveals something important about the cure's real purpose. It was not designed to help women cope with the genuine challenges of Victorian life. It was designed to enforce conformity among the class of women who had the education and resources to potentially challenge the system. It was corrective punishment disguised as compassionate care. By the 1920s and 1930s, the rest cure was falling out of favour as psychology and psychiatry developed new approaches to mental health. But echoes of it lasted much longer. Bed rest for pregnant women, isolation for mentally ill patients. The idea that women suffering from depression or anxiety need to be protected from overstimulation, from their own thoughts and desires. Even today we can see remnants of this thinking. When women express anger or frustration, They are sometimes told they are being too emotional, too hysterical, that they need to calm down. When women are ambitious or outspoken, they are sometimes pathologized, told they are too intense, too much. The rest cure is gone, but the impulse behind it, the desire to control women who refuse to be controlled, that is still very much with us. What the rest cure teaches us is that good intentions and medical authority are not enough to justify a treatment. We need to listen to patients, especially when they are telling us the cure is worse than the disease. We need to question treatments that require patients to give up their autonomy, their voice, their sense of self, and we need to be deeply suspicious of any cure that just happens to enforce social conformity while claiming to restore health. Charlotte Perkins Gilman survived the rest cure and went on to become one of the most important feminist thinkers of her era. She wrote, she spoke, she organized, she challenged every assumption Dr. Mitchell had tried to impose on her. Her story has a kind of happy ending, but we have to remember all the women whose stories we do not know. The women who internalized the message that their minds were sick, their desires were symptoms, their resistance was illness. The women who emerged from the rest cure diminished, believing they needed to be smaller, quieter, less ambitious to be well. They deserved better. They deserved actual care, actual rest, actual healing. They deserved doctors who listened instead of prescribed, who supported instead of controlled, who saw them as whole human beings instead of malfunctioning reproductive systems. In our next part, we are going to look at something that might seem lighter after the darkness of the rest cure, but is actually just as controlling in its own way. We are going to talk about posture during rest, about the rules governing how women were allowed to sit, recline, and position their bodies even in their own homes. Because apparently even the shape you made while resting could be morally wrong. We will explore that strange terrain coming up next. For now, breathe, move, stand up and stretch if you need to. Your body is yours. No one gets to tell you how to rest anymore. After everything we have explored about Victorian rest, the mandatory needlework, the forbidden novels, the horrifying rest cure, you might think that if a woman just wanted to lie down for a few minutes, she could at least do that however she wanted. You would be wrong, because even the physical act of resting, the actual positioning of a woman's body in space, was subject to intense scrutiny and rigid rules. Victorian society managed to turn even the simple act of sitting down into a complex moral and social performance. Right now, as you're listening to this, I want you to notice how you are positioned. Are you curled up in bed, sprawled on a couch, slouched in a chair with your feet up? Maybe you are lying on your seat or on your stomach, or in some position that just feels comfortable to you in this moment. Now imagine that every single one of those positions could be judged as improper, unladylike, or even immoral. Imagine that someone could walk in right now and criticize you for the way your spine is curved, the angle of your ankles, or whether your elbows are touching the armrest. That was daily reality for Victorian women, and the rules were incredibly specific. Emily Thornwell, in her 1856 Ladies' Guide to Perfect Gentility, devoted an entire section to proper posture during rest. She wrote, "A lady ought to adopt a modest and measured gait. Too great hurry can injure the grace which ought to characterize her." Notice that this is about walking, but she is calling it part of rest and leisure activities. Everything a woman did was supposed to demonstrate grace and control, even, especially, during moments of rest. But it gets much more detailed than that. According to Victorian etiquette manuals, when a lady sat down to rest, she needed to keep her back straight, her shoulders back, her head held high. She should sit lightly on the edge of the chair or sofa, not sink back into it. Her feet should be together or crossed at the ankles, never apart. Her hands should be folded in her lap or occupied with handwork, never hanging loosely or resting on the arms of the chair. One particularly popular etiquette book from 1875, The Habits of Good Society, specified that a lady should never lean back in her chair during social visits, as this suggested laziness and poor breeding. Even in her own home, if she was receiving visitors during calling hours, she was expected to maintain perfect posture for the entire duration of the visit, which could last anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Rest was never actually restful. It was another form of work, another performance, another way to demonstrate your value and virtue through constant physical control. But the posture rules were not just about etiquette and social graces. They were also wrapped up in medical beliefs about women's health. Victorian doctors had very specific ideas about how women's bodies should be positioned, especially in relation to their reproductive organs. And yes, it gets as weird and invasive as you are probably imagining. Doctors believed that lying completely flat on your back was dangerous for women because it could cause the womb to shift out of position. I am not making this up. There were actual medical papers published about this. One physician wrote in 1871 that women should always sleep with their upper body slightly elevated, using multiple pillows to prevent uterine displacement during sleep. But lying on your stomach was considered even worse. That position was thought to put pressure on the reproductive organs and could supposedly cause infertility, menstrual problems, and various female complaints. Some doctors even suggested that women who slept on their stomachs were more likely to have inappropriate dreams of a sexual nature. The logic, such as it was, suggested that the pressure on the abdomen caused stimulation that the mind would then translate into improper thoughts during sleep. So where could a Victorian woman rest comfortably? Well, that is where the fainting couch comes in. You've probably seen these in period dramas, those elegant curved couches designed specifically for reclining. They look beautiful in old photographs and period rooms. But understanding their actual purpose reveals a lot about Victorian attitudes toward women's bodies. The fainting couch, also called a chaise longue, was designed to allow a woman to recline without lying completely flat. The back was angled so that a woman could lean back while still maintaining some elevation of her upper body. The curve of the piece encouraged a specific posture, one that was considered both medically appropriate and visually graceful. But here is the thing about fainting couches that I find darkly amusing. They were called fainting couches because Victorian women fainted a lot. And why did they faint so frequently? Well, partly because they were wearing corsets laced so tightly that they could not breathe properly. The corset, which was considered essential for proper posture and modesty, compressed the rib cage and restricted breathing so severely that fainting from oxygen deprivation was a regular occurrence. So the solution to women fainting from their restrictive clothing was not to stop wearing the restrictive clothing. No. The solution was to design special furniture for them to collapse onto gracefully. And even that collapse had rules. A proper lady experiencing a fainting spell should, if possible, sink gently onto the nearest fainting couch in a becoming manner. An ungraceful sprawl was considered mortifying even in unconsciousness. Can you imagine? Even your body's involuntary response to suffocation was supposed to be performed correctly. The corset itself made proper rest posture nearly impossible to achieve comfortably. A tightly laced corset meant you could not bend at the waist, could not take a full deep breath, could not relax your core muscles. Sitting with a straight back was not just an etiquette rule, it was physically required by the boning and lacing of the undergarments. Slouching was not just improper, it was painful. The corset's rigid structure dug into your ribs if you tried to bend. So when we see those old photographs of Victorian women sitting with ramrod straight spines, we need to remember that this was not just social conditioning. This was also physical constraint. They literally could not slouch even if they wanted to. And sleeping in a corset was common practice for many women, despite the obvious discomfort. Some women loosened their laces at night, but many kept them on, especially young women or those trying to achieve a smaller waist. There were special sleeping corsets that were marketed as being more comfortable for nighttime wear, though contemporary accounts suggest they were still quite restrictive. Imagine trying to get restful sleep while your ribs are compressed and your breathing is restricted. Imagine trying to roll over in the night and being unable to bend your torso. This was normal for millions of women. This was what proper rest looked like. But the posture policing extended beyond just sitting and lying down. Even standing at rest had rules. When a woman was standing and conversing during a social event, she should stand with her weight evenly distributed, never shifting from foot to foot or leaning against walls or furniture. One etiquette manual warned that leaning suggested a slovenly character and lack of proper discipline. Walking, too, had its regulations during leisure time. A woman taking a healthful walk in the garden or park should move with measured, graceful steps. Not too fast, which would suggest unladylike haste and possibly raise her heart rate too much. Not too slow, which would suggest laziness. The perfect pace demonstrated both energy and restraint, purpose and grace, and we have not even talked about arms and hands yet. During rest periods, a woman's arms were never supposed to hang loosely at her sides. That looked slovenly. They should be occupied, holding a book, doing needlework arranged gracefully in the lap. If you were standing, your hands could clasp each other in front of you, or one hand could lightly rest on a piece of furniture, but never in a way that suggested you were using the furniture for support. The performance of effortless grace required exhausting constant effort. There are accounts from women's diaries and letters that give us glimpses into how tiring this constant vigilance was. One woman wrote in 1868 about attending an evening party where she had to stand for over 2 hours because there were not enough chairs. She described the pain in her feet and back, the struggle to maintain proper posture while her body screamed for rest, and the headache that developed from the combined strain. But she could not sit on the floor, could not lean against the wall, could not ask for special accommodation without appearing weak or improper. Another woman's diary from 1882 describes the relief she felt when her elderly aunt finally left after a lengthy visit. For 3 weeks she had maintained perfect posture during every waking hour, because her aunt was a stickler for propriety and would criticize any sign of slouching or relaxation. When the aunt departed, the woman wrote that she immediately collapsed upon the sofa like a rag doll, and did not care how it looked because there was finally no one watching. That phrase, "no one watching," appears over and over in women's private writings from this era. The constant surveillance, the awareness that your body was always being observed and judged, made true relaxation almost impossible. Women could only truly rest when they were completely alone, which, given the crowded nature of Victorian households and the presence of servants, was rare. Servants presented their own complicated dynamic in this surveillance system. On one hand, servants were supposed to be essentially invisible, not really counting as people watching in social terms. On the other hand, servants were definitely watching and definitely judging, and there was always the possibility that a servant would gossip about a mistress who was too relaxed, too casual, too comfortable in her own home. We have records of servants' accounts, written years later, describing the ladies they had worked for. Some remembered mistresses who maintained perfect posture at all times, even when alone. Others remembered women who would dramatically throw off their corsets the moment all visitors left and sprawl on the furniture in relief. The servants' opinions of these women often aligned with Victorian values. The always proper ladies were remembered as admirable, while the ones who relaxed too much were described as having low standards. The internalization of these rules went deep. Many women felt genuinely uncomfortable if they were not maintaining proper posture, even in private. They had been trained since childhood that slouching indicated moral weakness, that physical relaxation suggested mental laziness, that the body must always be controlled and disciplined. Think about what this did to the relationship women had with their own bodies. Your body became something to be managed, controlled, never trusted to find its own comfortable position. Rest became another battle against your body's natural desires. Even sleep, that most basic biological need, had to happen within strict parameters of acceptable positioning. And this is where the connection to modern life feels uncomfortably close. How many of us have been told to sit up straight so often that we feel guilty when we slouch? How many of us feel like we are being lazy if we lie on the couch in the middle of the day, even when we are exhausted? How many of us have internalized the idea that our bodies at rest should still look a certain way, should still be performing some kind of acceptable presentation? We may not have corsets and fainting couches anymore, but we have shapewear and athleisure wear that is supposed to make us look put together, even when we are supposedly relaxing. We have ergonomic furniture that tells us there is a right way and wrong way to sit. We have fitness trackers monitoring whether we are resting too much or not enough. The Victorian obsession with the proper rest posture might seem absurd, but the underlying anxiety that rest itself must be justified, controlled, performed correctly, that is still with us. What makes me saddest about the posture police of Victorian times is how it robbed women of comfort in their own bodies. The simple physical ease of stretching out, of letting your spine curve naturally, of positioning yourself in whatever way felt best. That basic bodily autonomy was denied in the name of propriety and health. And for what? To make women look more graceful? To demonstrate their discipline and self-control? Or was it, like everything else we've talked about, really about keeping women in a constant state of low-level discomfort and self-consciousness, making sure they never got too comfortable, never too relaxed, never forgot they were being watched and evaluated? I think you know the answer. The good news is that women did resist this too. They would throw off their corsets when they could. They would sprawl ungracefully in the privacy of their rooms. They would take secret pleasure in lying however they wanted when no one was watching. These small rebellions, these moments of bodily freedom mattered. They were reminders that the rules were arbitrary, that bodies had their own wisdom about what felt good and right. And eventually the rules changed. Women fought for the right to wear less restrictive clothing. The dress reform movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s challenged the corset and the layers of heavy skirts. Doctors, some doctors at least, began to acknowledge that maybe restricting breathing and movement was not actually healthy, regardless of what it looked like. But change came slowly, resisted every step of the way by people who genuinely believed that proper posture during rest was a moral issue, that allowing women to relax naturally would lead to societal collapse. So right now I invite you to notice your posture again, and if you are uncomfortable, shift, stretch, find a position that feels good to your body. Do not perform rest for anyone, just rest. Your spine is allowed to curve, your feet are allowed to be apart, your arms can hang wherever they feel natural. This is your body and this is your rest, and no one gets to tell you how to do it anymore. Coming up next, we are going to explore another exhausting aspect of Victorian rest. The social calendar that turned relaxation into work. Visiting hours, calling cards, tea parties that had more rules than a military operation, because apparently even socializing with friends needed to follow a script so complex that women needed guidebooks just to remember all the regulations. We will dive into that social maze shortly, but for now, slouch if you want to, sprawl if you need to. Your body knows what it needs better than any etiquette manual ever did. You know what sounds relaxing? Visiting a friend, just dropping by to chat, have a cup of tea, catch up on life. Maybe you stay for 20 minutes, maybe an hour, whatever feels natural. You leave when the conversation winds down or when you need to get going. Simple, right? Easy. Restful even. Victorian women would have found that description absolutely horrifying, because social visiting in the Victorian era was not relaxing at all. It was one of the most elaborate, stressful, rule-bound activities a woman could engage in, and it was categorized as leisure, as rest, as one of those gentle, feminine activities that filled a lady's day without being real work. Except it was work. Exhausting, anxiety-inducing, socially consequential work that required meticulous planning, perfect execution, and constant vigilance. And if you got it wrong, the social penalties could be severe. Let me walk you through what was called making calls in Victorian society. This was the system of formal social visiting that every middle-class and upper-class woman was expected to participate in. And I do mean expected. This was not optional. It was as much a duty as going to church or managing your household. Your social standing, your family's reputation, and even your marriage prospects could depend on whether you made the right calls at the right times to the right people. First, let us talk about timing. You could not just visit whenever you felt like it. There were designated calling hours, and these varied depending on the day of the week, the season, and even the city you lived in. In most places, the acceptable hours for making calls were between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. Not 2:30, not 5:15, 3 to 5. If you arrived outside these hours, you were committing a serious breach of etiquette. But wait, it gets more complicated. Those hours were for what were called formal calls or morning calls, which, despite the name, happened in the afternoon. I know, the Victorians were nothing if not confusing about their terminology. These formal afternoon visits were brief, ritualized encounters with specific rules about duration and behavior. According to the Habits of Good Society, the handbook published in 1875, a formal call should last between 15 and 30 minutes, not 14 minutes, not 35 minutes. You needed to stay long enough to be polite but leave before you overstayed your welcome. But how did you know exactly when that 15 to 30 minute window was up without obviously checking a watch, which would be rude? You had to develop an internal clock, sense of timing that told you when the socially acceptable duration had elapsed. Women would literally practice this at home, timing themselves in conversation to develop the skill of knowing when to make their excuses and leave. And who were you calling on? That was governed by an incredibly complex system of social obligation. If someone called on you, you had to return the call within a specific time frame, usually within a week. If you failed to return a call, it was interpreted as a deliberate snub, a social rejection that could have lasting consequences. But you could not return a call too quickly either, because that looked desperate or overly eager. There was also a hierarchy of calling. New arrivals to a neighbourhood or social circle had to wait for established residents to call on them first. A younger woman had to wait for an older woman to initiate contact. A woman of lower social rank could not call on someone of higher rank without first being called upon. Breaking these rules meant social exclusion. One Victorian woman's diary from 1879 includes an entire section where she is tracking her calls like a military campaign. She lists who she needs to call on, who has called on her, when she returned those calls, who she is still obligated to visit, and who has snubbed her by not returning her call. The mental energy required to maintain this system is staggering. Now, let us add the visiting card system into this already complicated scenario. Visiting cards were small cards, usually about 3 inches by 2 inches, with your name printed on them. When you made a call, you brought cards with you. If the lady of the house was not at home, meaning not receiving visitors that day, you would leave your card with the servant who answered the door. This told the lady that you had made the effort to call, and she would then be obligated to return your call or send her own card. But there were rules about the cards too. Oh, so many rules. If you were calling on a married woman and she had adult daughters, you needed to bring enough cards to leave one for the mother and one for each daughter. If you were a married woman calling on another married couple, you needed to leave your card plus 2 of your husband's cards, one for the husband, one for the wife. Getting the number of cards wrong was embarrassing and improper, and the cards themselves had to be perfect, the right size, the right quality of paper, the right typeface. Too fancy suggested you were putting on airs. Too plain suggested you were cheap or lacked taste. One etiquette manual from 1882 devoted 3 full pages to the proper appearance and use of visiting cards. Are you starting to feel exhausted just thinking about this? Because we are not done yet. When you arrived for a call, assuming the lady was at home and receiving visitors, you would be shown into the drawing room or parlour. You would greet your hostess, exchange pleasantries, and then sit in one of the designated visitor chairs. Never the most comfortable seats. Those were reserved for family. Remember, you had to maintain perfect posture the entire time, even though you were supposedly there to rest and socialize. The conversation had rules too. You could discuss certain topics, but not others. The weather was always safe. Recent social events were acceptable. Mutual acquaintances could be discussed, but only in positive or neutral terms. Gossip was frowned upon, at least officially. You could not discuss politics, religion, money, or anything that might lead to disagreement or controversy. And you absolutely could not discuss anything personal about yourself. Remember that etiquette rule we mentioned before? Never introduce your own affairs for the amusement of the company. This meant you could not talk about your problems, your struggles, your genuine feelings. The conversation had to remain pleasant, superficial, and emotionally safe. So you were sitting in an uncomfortable chair, maintaining perfect posture, making pleasant conversation about nothing important, keeping careful track of time, and performing graciousness and interest you might not actually feel. And this was rest. This was leisure. This was how women were supposed to relax and enjoy themselves. The physical toll of this was real. Women would make anywhere from 3 to 12 calls in a single afternoon. That meant getting dressed in formal calling attire, a different outfit than you wore at home, something suitable for being seen in public. It meant taking a carriage or walking from house to house. It meant sitting and standing repeatedly, performing the same ritualized conversation multiple times, smiling until your face hurt. One account from 1885 describes a woman who made 9 calls in one afternoon and came home with a splitting headache, swollen feet from her tight shoes, and complete exhaustion. But she could not skip this activity because she owed these calls. Social obligation demanded it, and there was always the anxiety of not knowing what you would encounter. Would the lady be at home, or would you just leave cards? If she was receiving, would there be other visitors already there, requiring you to navigate multiple conversations and social dynamics? Would the hostess be warm and welcoming or cool and distant? Every call was a performance, and you never knew if you were performing well enough. The at-home system itself was another layer of complexity. A woman would designate certain days when she was at home to receive callers. She might be at home on Tuesdays and Fridays, for example. This information would be communicated through her social circle, and women were expected to remember who was at home on which days. If you showed up on the wrong day, the servant would turn you away, and you would have wasted your time and effort. But here is the truly maddening part. Even on her designated at-home day, a woman could tell the servant to say she was not at home if she did not want to see a particular caller. This was understood as a polite fiction. The servant would answer the door and say, "Mrs. So-and-so is not at home," even though the caller might be able to see through the window that Mrs. So-and-so was clearly sitting in the parlour. Everyone understood this was a euphemism for "she is not receiving you," but the polite fiction had to be maintained. Being turned away in this manner was humiliating, especially if you suspected the lady was actually home and simply refusing to see you. It was a social rejection delivered through coded language, and it could signal that you had fallen out of favour or committed some unknown breach of etiquette. The emotional labour of all this was immense. You had to remember who had called on you and when. You had to track your obligations. You had to decode social signals about who was snubbing whom. You had to maintain a cheerful, interested demeanour even when you were exhausted or dealing with personal troubles. You had to wear clothes that were uncomfortable. You had to sit in ways that hurt your back. And all of this was happening during what was supposed to be your rest time. The afternoon hours, 3 to 5, were theoretically leisure hours, but they were filled with this exhausting social choreography that required constant mental and emotional effort. One particularly telling detail comes from etiquette guides that advised women on how to prevent callers from overstaying their welcome. The hostess was supposed to subtly signal when the visit should end, perhaps by standing or by making a comment about other obligations, or simply through tone and body language. But she could not be too obvious about it, because that would be rude, so she had to communicate, "Please leave now," while appearing to be enjoying the visit immensely. Meanwhile, the visitor had to be alert to these signals and gracefully make her exit without appearing to have been dismissed. The whole thing was an elaborate dance, where both parties were pretending things they did not feel, and reading between lines of things that were not being said. Do you have friends you see regularly? Think about what it would be like if every single interaction with them followed this kind of script, if you could never just relax and be yourself, if every visit had to be timed, formal, and emotionally controlled, if your friendships existed primarily to fulfill social obligations rather than genuine connection. That is what social calling was for many Victorian women. It was not about friendship, not really. It was about maintaining social position, fulfilling obligations, performing respectability. Real friendship, real emotional intimacy, real rest in someone else's company. Those things had to happen in the margins, in the rare moments when the rules relaxed slightly. Some women found ways around this. They would have what were called informal visits with close friends, visits that happened outside the official calling hours that lasted as long as both parties wanted, where conversation could be genuine and personal. But even these informal visits carried some risk. If word got out that you were having relaxed, intimate visits with certain friends while maintaining formal distance with others, it could create social friction. The class dimensions of all this are important to note. This elaborate calling system was primarily for middle-class and upper-class women who had the leisure time and resources to participate. Working-class women did not make formal calls. They visited each other in much more casual ways when work allowed. The calling card system, the designated at-home days, the formal afternoon visits, these were markers of class status. But that meant that for the women who did participate in this system, it was essential to get it right. Failing at the social calling game could mean losing your tenuous grasp on middle-class respectability. It could affect your husband's business prospects, your children's marriage prospects, your family's standing in the community. So women pushed through the exhaustion, the headaches, the swollen feet. They kept meticulous records of who had called and when. They maintained their calling card supplies. They dressed appropriately, they smiled and chatted, and performed graciousness day after day after day. And they called it rest. They called it leisure. They called it the pleasant social activity that filled a lady's afternoon. The irony is that we still do versions of this. We still have social obligations that exhaust us, but that we cannot skip without consequences. We still perform interest and energy we do not feel because social situations demand it. We still track who has reached out to whom and worry about whether we are keeping up with our friendship obligations. The forms have changed. We text instead of leaving cards. We meet for coffee instead of formal afternoon calls. but the underlying dynamic of social obligation disguised as leisure is still very much with us. What Victorian social calling teaches us is that rest and leisure are not the same as having free time. You can have hours that are technically not devoted to work or household duties, but if those hours are filled with obligation, performance, and anxiety, they are not restful. They are just a different kind of labour. True rest, true leisure requires freedom. The freedom to choose who you spend time with. The freedom to be yourself without performing a role. The freedom to let a visit last as long as it needs to or to end it when you are tired. The freedom to say no to social obligations that drain you without facing severe consequences. Victorian women rarely had that freedom. Their afternoons were scheduled, their visits were scripted, their social interactions were work dressed up as pleasure. So maybe the next time you are dreading a social obligation, you can take some comfort in the fact that at least you do not have to track calling cards, memorize at-home days, and time your visits with a mental stopwatch. Though if you do end up at a gathering that feels exhausting rather than restful, know that you are not alone. You are part of a long tradition of people who have had to navigate the complicated space between genuine connection and social performance. In our next part, we are going to explore another aspect of Victorian rest that might surprise you: the rules around music and performance. Because playing piano or singing was considered a restful leisure activity, but it came with its own set of pressures and expectations that turned even artistic expression into another form of work. But that is coming up next. For now, if you need to cancel plans to actually rest, do it. The calling cards can wait. Among all the accomplishments expected of a Victorian lady, few were as visible, as socially consequential, and as anxiety-producing as musical ability. If you could play the piano beautifully, or sing with a lovely voice, you were considered an accomplished woman, a desirable marriage prospect, a credit to your family. If you could not, well, that was a serious deficit that needed to be explained or apologized for at every social gathering. And the truly maddening part: this musical performance was categorized as leisure, as rest, as one of those gentle feminine pursuits that filled your evening hours with pleasant, relaxing activity. Never mind that achieving the level of skill expected required hours of daily practice, constant performance anxiety, and the pressure of knowing that your value as a woman was literally being judged by how well you could play a Chopin nocturne in front of a room full of critical listeners. Let me take you into a Victorian parlour on a typical evening. The family has finished dinner. If there are guests, they've retired to the drawing room for the evening's entertainment. And at some point, inevitably, someone will suggest that the young lady of the house should play for the company. This is not really a suggestion. It is an expectation disguised as a request. Refusing would be unthinkably rude, suggesting either that you lack the skill to perform or that you consider yourself too important to entertain your guests. So you sit down at the piano. Your hands might be trembling slightly, your heart might be racing. You are about to be judged, evaluated, compared to other young women these guests have heard play. But you must appear calm, gracious, and delighted to perform. Any sign of nervousness or reluctance reflects poorly on your character. And then there are the rules about what you play and for how long. An etiquette manual called A Handbook of Etiquette for Ladies laid out a particularly specific guideline: never sing more than 1 or 2 songs consecutively. This rule appears in multiple Victorian etiquette books, always phrased with that stern never that makes it sound like singing 3 songs in a row would be a moral failing comparable to theft. But why? Why could you not sing 3 or 4 songs if people were enjoying your performance? The logic, such as it was, centered on the idea that monopolizing attention was vulgar and unladylike. You should perform just enough to demonstrate your accomplishments, but not so much that you appear to be showing off or seeking excessive praise. You needed to find that perfect balance between competence and modesty, between skill and self-effacement. The problem, of course, is that this balance was nearly impossible to achieve. If you played one piece and it was brilliant, people might think you were holding back or being falsely modest. If you played two pieces and both were excellent, you might be accused of vanity. If you made any mistakes, you were clearly not accomplished enough. And if you played perfectly but without enough emotion, you were merely mechanical, not truly musical. There was no way to win. The performance itself was not really about music. It was about demonstrating that you had spent years developing a skill that proved your family's wealth and status. Wealthy enough to afford a piano, to pay for lessons, to give you the leisure time to practice for hours every day. The actual quality of the music was almost secondary to what it signaled about your place in society. The amount of practice required to reach performance-ready skill was substantial. Young girls typically began piano lessons around age 6 or 7. By their teenage years, they were expected to practice 2 to 3 hours every single day. Not when they felt inspired, not when they had free time, every day, regardless of what else was happening in their lives. One Victorian woman's diary from 1871 describes her daily routine. After breakfast, 2 hours of piano practice, then needlework and household duties, then more piano practice in the afternoon. Then in the evening she might be called upon to actually perform. The practice was invisible labour that no one acknowledged. The performance was the only part that counted socially, and the physical toll of this much playing was real. Repetitive strain injuries were common among women who played regularly. One medical journal from 1889 described what was called piano player's cramp, a painful condition affecting the fingers and wrists from hours of repetitive motion. The treatment? Rest from playing, which was socially unthinkable if you were expected to perform regularly. So women played through pain. They developed their own techniques for managing discomfort. They would soak their hands in warm water before performing, wear special gloves, or take brief breaks during practice when no one was watching. But they could not complain, could not acknowledge the physical cost because that would ruin the illusion that they were effortlessly accomplished. The repertoire expected of a proper Victorian lady had its own rules and restrictions. You should know a variety of pieces, some classical, some popular songs of the day, perhaps some sacred music for Sunday evenings, but the pieces should not be too difficult, because that would look like showing off. And they should not be too simple, because that would suggest lack of skill. Furthermore, the emotional content of the music mattered. Pieces that were too passionate or dramatic were considered inappropriate for young, unmarried women. One etiquette guide warned against playing music that expressed unseemly emotions that a virtuous woman should not be feeling. Apparently even your choice of musical repertoire could cast doubt on your moral character. Singing came with even more restrictions. A woman's singing voice was considered particularly revealing of her inner nature. A pure, sweet voice indicated a pure, sweet character. A voice that was too loud or too dramatic suggested a passionate, possibly dangerous temperament. Voice teachers would coach young women not just in technique, but in the proper emotional restraint that should characterize a lady's singing. And there was the matter of stage presence. When you performed, you should appear both confident and modest. You should acknowledge applause with a gracious nod, but not seem too pleased with yourself. If you made a mistake, you should continue smoothly without drawing attention to it. If someone complimented your playing afterward, you should deflect the praise with something like, "Oh, I am quite out of practice," or "You're too kind, I made several errors." To accept a compliment directly was considered vain and improper, or even the moment after a performance, when you might feel genuinely proud of having played well, you had to perform modesty and self-deprecation. The comparison culture around musical accomplishment was brutal. Mothers would compare their daughters' abilities. Young women would be evaluated against each other. If two families were visiting and both had daughters who played, There was an unspoken competition about who would perform better. The tension in the room during these dueling performances must have been extraordinary. One account from 1868 describes a social evening where 3 young women each played for the assembled guests. The writer notes that the third girl, whose playing was technically superior to the others, still received less enthusiastic applause because she had an air of pride about her performance that was unbecoming. She had played beautifully, but had committed the sin of appearing to know she was skilled. Better to play adequately with perfect modesty than brilliantly with visible confidence. This did something deeply damaging to women's relationship with music. What could have been a genuine source of joy, expression, and creativity became instead another arena of judgment and performance anxiety. Many women who were forced to practice for hours as girls never touched a piano again once they were married and no longer needed to perform for marriage prospects. But some women found ways to reclaim music for themselves. They would play alone, in private, choosing pieces that moved them rather than pieces that impressed others. They would sing in their rooms when no one could hear, letting their voices be loud or passionate without fear of judgment. Music that began as obligation sometimes transformed into genuine refuge. There are beautiful accounts of women describing how music saved them during difficult times. One woman wrote in 1883 about how, after a devastating personal loss, she could not talk to anyone or express her grief in socially acceptable ways, but she could play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in the evening, and somehow the music expressed what she could not say. No one knew she was grieving through the piano. They just thought she was being an accomplished lady, filling the evening hours with pleasant sound. The irony is that while women were criticized for being too emotional, music was one of the few acceptable outlets for emotion, as long as that emotion was properly channeled and controlled. You could express melancholy through a Chopin piece, but not anger, sweetness through a simple song, but not passion. Even in artistic expression, women's emotional range was severely restricted. And then there is the question of what happened to women who genuinely wanted to pursue music seriously, as a profession or art form rather than just an accomplishment. The answer for most of the Victorian era was that they could not. Professional musicians were considered unsuitable for respectable women. Performing for money rather than just for family and friends put you in a category with actresses and other women of questionable reputation. There were exceptions, of course. Some women managed to have professional music careers, but they faced enormous social prejudice and practical obstacles. They were excluded from major orchestras, from prestigious teaching positions, from many performance venues. Their music was judged not just on its quality, but on whether it was appropriate for a woman to have created it. Clara Schumann, the famous pianist and composer, spent her life navigating these restrictions. She was extraordinarily talented, widely acknowledged as one of the finest pianists of her generation, but she was constantly managing the tension between her professional aspirations and the social expectations of proper femininity. She performed publicly, which was scandalous for a respectable woman. She composed music but often published it under her husband's name or not at all, because women composers were not taken seriously. For every Clara Schumann who managed to break through despite the obstacles, there were hundreds or thousands of women whose musical talents were never developed beyond the parlor performance level, because that was all that was considered appropriate. The expectations around musical accomplishment also reveal the class divides we have seen in every other aspect of Victorian rest. Upper-class and middle-class women were expected to play piano and sing because they had the resources for instruments and lessons. Working-class women might sing folk songs or hymns, but they were not expected to demonstrate formal musical training. The piano in the parlour was a status symbol as much as a musical instrument, and maintaining that piano, keeping it tuned, replacing broken strings, maintaining the proper humidity to prevent warping, all of that required money and servants. The piano itself was a visible marker of wealth, sitting prominently in the drawing room where visitors could not fail to notice it. Some families would buy a piano they could barely afford just to maintain the appearance of middle-class respectability, even if no one in the house could play it very well. The presence of the instrument mattered as much as the music that came from it. Now, think about our modern relationship with creative hobbies. How many of us feel like we have to be good at things to justify doing them? How many of us feel anxious about sharing our creative work because we are worried about being judged? How many of us have turned things we once enjoyed into sources of stress and performance anxiety? The Victorian musical accomplishment system might be gone, but the underlying dynamic of turning art into obligation, of judging people's worth by their creative output, of making leisure activities into another form of competitive performance, that is still very much with us. Social media has created new versions of this. We perform our hobbies for an audience. We curate our creative work to appear both skilled and modest. We deflect compliments while secretly hoping for validation. We compare ourselves to others and feel inadequate. The piano in the Victorian parlour has been replaced by the Instagram feed, but the anxiety is remarkably similar. What I find most heartbreaking about the Victorian musical rules is how they took something that could bring genuine joy and turned it into another burden. Music can be transcendent, it can be healing, it can be a way to express things that words cannot capture. But when it becomes something you are required to do, when every note is being judged, when your performance reflects on your worth as a person, the joy disappears. And yet, some women held on to that joy anyway. They practiced because they loved it, not just because they had to. They played for themselves, not just for others. They found in music a kind of freedom that was denied to them in every other part of their lives. The same activity that was used to control them could also, in quiet moments, be a form of resistance and self-expression. So if you play an instrument or sing, or make any kind of art, I hope you can do it sometimes just for yourself, not to perform for anyone, not to achieve anything, not to prove you are accomplished or skilled or worthy, just because the act itself brings you something you need. That would have been a radical act in the Victorian era. It is still pretty radical now. Coming up next, we are going to venture outside into the supposedly healthful world of Victorian exercise and fresh air. Because, of course, even outdoor activities came with elaborate rules about how far you could walk, what you could wear, and exactly how to hold your skirts while crossing the street. The control of women's bodies extended even to their movement through public spaces, and some of the restrictions are going to shock you, but we will explore that landscape shortly. For now, if you want to sing or play something, go ahead. Do not worry about whether you're good enough or whether anyone else would enjoy it. Music is yours to make, not just yours to perform. If there was one thing Victorian doctors agreed on, it was that fresh air and gentle exercise were essential for women's health. Women were encouraged, actually prescribed, to take daily walks for their constitution, to breathe the outdoor air, to engage in mild physical activity that would strengthen them without overtaxing their delicate systems. Finally, you might think, something resembling actual rest and wellness in the Victorian playbook. Except, of course, there were rules. So many rules that a simple walk around the block became another complex performance requiring constant vigilance, specific clothing, careful timing, and the ever-present awareness that you were being watched and judged every step of the way. Let us start with the most basic Victorian exercise recommendation, the daily walk. This was considered the ideal form of exercise for women, not too strenuous, properly feminine, an activity that could be done in respectable clothing. Medical guides from the 1870s and 1880s regularly prescribed walking as beneficial for everything from digestive troubles to nervous disorders to that catch-all diagnosis we keep encountering, neurasthenia. But how you walked mattered intensely. Thomas E. Hill's Manual of Social and Business Forms, published in 1875, included detailed instructions on proper walking technique for ladies. You should walk with measured, graceful steps, not too fast, which would suggest unladylike haste and cause unseemly perspiration, not too slow, which would appear lazy or affected. Your arms should move naturally but not swing too much. Your head should be held high but not in a way that suggested pride. And then there was the dress issue. Walking required special attire, and managing that attire was its own complicated skill. When crossing a paved area or muddy street, a lady was instructed to raise her dress slightly to prevent the hem from dragging in the dirt. But how you raised your dress was governed by strict etiquette rules. Here is the exact instruction from Hill's manual. When crossing the pavement, a lady should raise her dress with the right hand a little above the ankle. To raise the dress with both hands is vulgar, and can only be excused when mud is very deep. Read that again. Raising your dress with both hands was vulgar. Even when walking through deep mud, you were supposed to manage with one hand if at all possible, because using both hands was considered unrefined and lower class. Can you imagine the awkwardness of this? You're trying to walk gracefully while holding several pounds of fabric in one hand, maintaining proper posture, watching where you step, all while appearing completely calm and elegant. And heaven forbid you lift the hem too high. Showing more than your ankle was scandalous, but letting your expensive dress drag in the mud was wasteful and slovenly. Women developed specific techniques for this. Some would loop a ribbon or cord through the hem of their walking dresses so they could raise it with one hand without bunching the fabric awkwardly. Others mastered a particular wrist movement that allowed them to gather the fabric efficiently. It was a skill taught to young girls alongside all the other elaborate physical maneuvers expected of proper ladies. The timing of walks also mattered. Morning walks were considered healthful but should not be too early, as being out before a respectable hour suggested you were lower class or had work to do. Afternoon walks during the social calling hours we discussed earlier had to be carefully navigated. You might encounter people you knew, requiring you to stop and exchange greetings, but you could not appear to be loitering or seeking attention. Evening walks presented their own challenges. An 1872 etiquette manual warned that a lady should never walk alone after twilight because doing so would cast doubt on her character. Women seen walking alone in the evening were often assumed to be prostitutes. So even something as simple as stepping outside your door after sunset required a chaperone or companion. And speaking of chaperones, unmarried women were almost never allowed to walk alone, even during daylight hours. They needed to be accompanied by a family member, a servant, or an older married woman. Walking alone suggested you were seeking male attention or were willing to entertain improper advances. The streets were not safe spaces for unaccompanied women, not because of actual danger necessarily, but because of social judgment. One woman's diary from 1868 describes her frustration at needing to coordinate her walks with the availability of her elderly aunt who served as her chaperone. Some days she wanted to walk, but her aunt was not feeling well. Other days the weather was perfect, but her aunt was busy with household matters. The simple act of going outside for exercise became dependent on someone else's schedule and willingness. The physical restrictions of Victorian clothing made exercise even more challenging. We have talked about corsets already, but think about what it means to try to walk briskly while your rib cage is compressed and your breathing is restricted. Victorian women were literally breathless from their undergarments, making any kind of vigorous activity extremely difficult. The weight of the clothing was also substantial. A full Victorian outfit, including all the layers of undergarments, petticoats, the dress itself, and outerwear if needed, could weigh 15 to 20 pounds. Imagine trying to take a healthful walk while carrying a 20-pound weight strapped to your body. Your legs, back, and feet would be working much harder than the walk itself required. And the shoes. Victorian women's shoes were often poorly constructed, with little arch support and narrow toe boxes that crushed the feet. Walking any distance in these shoes was painful, leading to blisters, bunions, and chronic foot problems. But complaining about discomfort would be unladylike, so women suffered silently. The duration of walks was also prescribed. Most medical guides recommended 30 to 45 minutes of walking per day, not longer, because that would risk overexertion. Women were believed to have limited physical stamina, and pushing beyond safe limits could supposedly damage their reproductive systems. This belief was held so strongly that some doctors warned that too much walking could cause a woman's uterus to literally fall out of place. This sounds absurd now, but it was published in medical journals. Doctors genuinely believed that vigorous exercise could cause uterine prolapse in women, and this belief was used to restrict women's physical activity well into the early 20th century. But in the 1890s, something revolutionary happened. The bicycle arrived. And with it came one of the most intense debates about women's health, morality, and physical freedom in Victorian history. Bicycles offered women unprecedented mobility and independence. You could travel much farther on a bicycle than on foot. You could go alone, moving too quickly for a chaperone to easily follow. You could feel the wind in your hair and the exhilaration of speed and freedom. And Victorian society absolutely panicked. Doctors published papers warning about the dangers of bicycles for women. In 1896, a series of letters in Canadian medical journals debated whether women seated on bicycle seats could experience orgasms from the vibration and pressure. I am not joking. Respectable medical professionals were writing to each other, seriously concerned that bicycles would cause women to become sexually aroused, leading to what they called oversexed females and potential moral collapse. One physician wrote that allowing women to ride bicycles could create a nation of women with dangerous and inappropriate desires. Another suggested that women who enjoyed cycling too much were showing signs of moral degeneracy and should be discouraged from the activity for their own good. The fear was not just about the physical sensations, it was about the freedom. A woman on a bicycle was mobile, independent, difficult to supervise. She could go where she wanted, when she wanted. She did not need a chaperone. She did not need anyone's permission. This terrified the authorities, who had spent decades creating elaborate systems to control women's movement and behaviour. There were also concerns about cycling attire. You simply could not ride a bicycle in a long Victorian skirt. The fabric would get caught in the wheels and chain, creating dangerous situations. So women who cycled began wearing what were called rational dress options, split skirts or even bloomers, loose trousers gathered at the ankle. This was considered shockingly improper. Women wearing trousers, showing the shape of their legs, moving their limbs freely. Newspaper editorials railed against the immodesty of cycling attire. Clergy preached sermons about the moral dangers of women in bloomers. Some towns actually tried to pass ordinances banning women from cycling on public roads, but women kept cycling anyway, because it felt good, because it was fun, because it offered a kind of physical freedom they had never experienced before. Susan B. Anthony, the famous women's rights activist, said in 1896, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. The bicycle allowed women to experience their bodies as strong, capable, and powerful rather than delicate, fragile and in need of constant protection. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous to the entire Victorian system of feminine restriction, and the backlash reveals just how invested society was in keeping women physically limited. When women started demonstrating that they could, in fact, engage in vigorous exercise without their reproductive organs failing, without becoming oversexed, without losing their femininity, it challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and physical capability. Beyond walking and cycling, other forms of exercise were largely forbidden to respectable women for most of the Victorian era. Running? Absolutely not. That would cause perspiration, which was unladylike, and the bouncing motion was considered harmful to female anatomy. Swimming? Possible in limited circumstances, but only in special bathing costumes that covered the entire body and only in sex-segregated areas. And certainly not swimming competitively or athletically, just gentle floating and wading. Team sports were completely out of the question for most of the Victorian period. Playing sports required running, sweating, competing, all things considered inappropriate for women. Some women's colleges in the late 1800s began introducing sports like basketball and tennis for their students, but these were controversial and often conducted in secret or in carefully controlled environments away from male observation. The idea that physical exercise could be actually enjoyable for women, that exertion and challenge and pushing your body's limits could feel good. This was not acknowledged in Victorian medical or social discourse. Exercise for women was framed entirely as a health obligation, something done to maintain the body for its reproductive purpose, never as something valuable in itself. What this meant was that many Victorian women went through their entire lives, never experiencing what their bodies were truly capable of. They never ran full speed. They never climbed a mountain. They never swam in open water. They never felt the satisfaction of physical exhaustion from challenging yourself and succeeding. The long-term health consequences of this enforced inactivity were significant. Weak muscles, poor cardiovascular health, bone problems from lack of weight-bearing exercise. Victorian women suffered from ailments that we now know are prevented or improved by regular physical activity. But they were told exercise was dangerous for them, that their bodies were too delicate, that rest and restriction were healthier than movement and strength. And there's a terrible irony in the fact that while women were being told they were too weak for exercise, they were also expected to manage all the physical labour of household management. Climbing stairs multiple times a day, carrying water, doing laundry by hand, all tasks that required significant strength and endurance. Working-class women laboured in factories, fields, and mines, doing back-breaking work that would have horrified doctors if they had suggested it for their middle-class patients. The exercise restrictions, like all the Victorian rest rules, were really about class and control. They were about keeping a certain class of women visible, decorative, and dependent. They were about preventing women from experiencing their own physical power and autonomy. But what gives me hope in this history is how women resisted even this. They walked further than they were supposed to. They secretly went swimming. They climbed trees in private gardens. They rode bicycles despite the scandal. They found ways to move, to breathe deeply, to feel their bodies doing what bodies are meant to do, and eventually their resistance won. The early 20th century saw the beginning of real changes in women's physical freedom. Dress reform made clothing more practical. Sports became acceptable, then celebrated. Women ran marathons, climbed mountains, swam the English Channel. They proved over and over that the Victorian doctors had been wrong about female physical capacity. Every woman athlete today, every woman who runs, lifts weights, plays sports, hikes, cycles, moves her body however she wants, is part of a long tradition of women who refuse to accept that their bodies were too delicate, too weak, too inappropriate for physical strength and freedom. But we should also remember that those early cyclists faced real social consequences. Women who were too athletic were considered unfeminine, unmarriageable, possibly deviant. Some of those old anxieties still linger. Women athletes still face comments about their bodies not being feminine enough. Women who are very strong or very fast still sometimes feel pressure to apologize for it or feminize their appearance to compensate. The Victorian fear of women's physical power has not entirely disappeared. It has just taken new forms. But every time a woman moves her body for the joy of it, for the challenge of it, for the sheer pleasure of being strong and capable, she is breaking the chains that Victorian society tried so hard to forge. Coming up next, we are going to explore what happened when women tried to rest in the most basic sense, actual sleep. Because even nighttime, even the unconscious hours, were subject to rules and medical opinions about what was healthy, proper and acceptable for women. You might be surprised by just how much anxiety and regulation surrounded something as fundamental as closing your eyes and sleeping, but we will drift into that topic shortly. For now, if you want to move, move. Stretch, walk, run if you feel like it. Your body was made for movement, not for ornamental stillness. Sleep, the most universal human need, the one activity where we surrender consciousness, where our bodies take over and do what they need without our minds interfering. Surely you might think, this was one area where Victorian women could escape all the rules and regulations and just rest. Surely sleep was beyond the reach of etiquette manuals and social judgment. You would be wrong. Victorian society managed to impose rules even on the unconscious hours, creating elaborate guidelines about when women could sleep, where they could sleep, how they should position themselves while sleeping, and what it meant about their character if they needed too much or too little. Rest. The concept of daytime rest, what we might call napping, was particularly fraught with social meaning. On one hand, Victorian medical wisdom held that women were naturally more delicate and tired, more easily than men, requiring periodic rest throughout the day. On the other hand, sleeping during daytime hours was associated with laziness, moral weakness, and lower-class behavior. Women had to navigate this impossible contradiction constantly. The acceptable form of daytime rest was called lying down rather than napping. This semantic distinction mattered enormously. A lady might say she was going to lie down for a bit after lunch, but she would never say she was going to take a nap. Napping sounded childish or slovenly. Lying down sounded medically necessary and properly feminine. And the timing of this lying down period was strictly regulated. The only socially acceptable time was immediately after lunch, typically between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. This post-lunch rest was considered medically beneficial, supposedly aiding digestion and preventing afternoon fatigue. But resting at any other time of day suggested either laziness or genuine illness. One etiquette guide from 1878 specified, "A lady may retire to her chamber for repose after the midday meal, but she must be available for afternoon callers by 3 o'clock at the latest. To be found resting later suggests an indolent disposition." So even your rest had a deadline. You had to time your lying down period precisely to ensure you were refreshed and presentable for the social obligations that would follow. And where could you rest? This is where it gets even more peculiar. You could not simply go to your bedroom and nap in your bed during the daytime. That was far too informal, too suggestive of actual sleep rather than genteel repose. Instead, many Victorian homes had special daytime resting furniture. The fainting couches and chaise lounges we discussed earlier, or what was sometimes called a rest couch, specifically for afternoon lying down. These pieces of furniture were usually placed in a private sitting room or dressing room, not in the bedroom itself. The bedroom was for nighttime sleep only. Using your bed during daylight hours was considered improper except in cases of genuine illness. This meant that Daytime rest happened in semi-public spaces where you might be interrupted, where servants might enter, where you could not fully undress or truly relax. What you wore while resting also mattered. You could loosen your corset slightly, very slightly, but you could not remove it. You certainly could not change into night clothes in the middle of the day. You would rest in your day dress, perhaps with some buttons undone or laces loosened, but essentially fully clothed. Comfort was secondary to propriety, and the shame associated with needing this rest was palpable in women's private writings. One diary entry from 1873 describes a woman feeling mortified that she needed to lie down in the afternoon because it suggested weakness. She wrote about trying to push through her exhaustion rather than rest because she did not want the servants to think she was lazy. When she finally did lie down, she felt guilty the entire time and could not actually relax. Another woman's letter from 1881 mentions that her mother-in-law made critical comments about how often she needed to rest, implying that a truly capable woman would not require such frequent lying down periods. This created a situation where women were simultaneously told they needed rest for their health and ashamed for actually taking that rest. The judgment often came from other women, mothers judging daughters-in-law, older women judging younger ones. The internalized belief that needing rest indicated moral or physical weakness meant that women policed each other, perpetuating a system that harmed them all. Servants added another layer of surveillance to daytime rest. In households with domestic help, servants would know exactly how often their mistress rested during the day. This information could become gossip, spreading through the servant network and potentially reaching other households. A reputation for always lying down could damage a woman's social standing. Some women developed strategies to rest without it being obvious. They would sit very still in chairs rather than lying on couches. They would rest their eyes while appearing to read. They would retreat to their rooms claiming they needed to change clothes or attend to correspondence, and then lie down briefly before anyone noticed how long they'd been gone. The elaborate deception required just to rest for 20 minutes in the middle of the day is almost comical, except for how sad it is. Women were exhausted, from corsets restricting their breathing, from heavy clothing weighing them down, from constant performance of propriety, from all the things we have discussed in this series. They desperately needed rest, but they could not take it without risk of judgment. Now let us talk about nighttime sleep, which you would think would be more straightforward, but of course was not. Victorian medical texts had very specific opinions about how much sleep women needed, what time they should go to bed, how they should position themselves while sleeping, and what various sleep patterns revealed about their character and health. The recommended amount of sleep for women was typically 7 to 8 hours per night, similar to modern recommendations, but the timing mattered. Going to bed too early suggested you were country folk or lower class. Going to bed too late suggested moral laxity or participation in unsuitable entertainment. The ideal bedtime for a respectable middle-class woman was around 10 or 11 in the evening. But this could vary depending on social obligations. If there was a dinner party or evening entertainment, you might not retire until midnight or even later. But then you were still expected to rise at a respectable hour in the morning. Sleeping past 8 or 9 was considered lazy, except for the wealthy elite who could afford such indulgence. This meant that women often operated on insufficient sleep, especially during busy social seasons when evening obligations were frequent. But complaining about tiredness was unseemly. You were supposed to appear fresh and energetic regardless of how little sleep you had actually gotten. The sleeping position was also subject to medical opinion. We mentioned earlier that doctors believed lying completely flat on your back could cause uterine displacement. This was such a widely held belief that many women slept propped up on multiple pillows in a semi-reclining position that supposedly kept everything properly aligned. Sleeping on your stomach was considered even more problematic. A medical text from 1886 warned that this position exerts undue pressure upon the female organs and may lead to excitation of improper sensations during sleep. They were worried that women might have sexual dreams if they slept on their stomachs. The recommended position was on your right side, slightly propped up with your limbs arranged modestly. Can you imagine trying to fall asleep while constantly monitoring your sleeping position to ensure it remains medically and morally acceptable? Sleep requires letting go of conscious control, but Victorian women were supposed to maintain propriety even in unconsciousness, and there was anxiety about what happened during sleep that you could not control. Dreams, particularly vivid or emotional dreams, were considered revealing of a woman's inner state. If a woman reported having frequent dreams, it might be interpreted as a sign of nervous disorder or inappropriate mental activity. So women learned not to discuss their dreams or to censor their accounts of them, presenting only the most bland and acceptable dream content. Sleepwalking was seen as particularly concerning. It suggested a lack of mental control, a vulnerability that was both fascinating and frightening to Victorian society. Women who sleepwalked were sometimes thought to be revealing hidden desires or engaging in behaviours they would not consciously permit themselves. There were also beliefs about what different sleep patterns revealed about character. Women who fell asleep easily were considered placid and untroubled, which was good. But women who fell asleep too easily might be seen as simple-minded or lacking proper sensitivity. Women who had trouble falling asleep were thought to be overly intellectual or emotionally agitated, which was concerning. Women who woke frequently during the night were suspected of harbouring guilty secrets or inappropriate desires. Every aspect of sleep was interpreted as revealing something about a woman's moral and mental state. There was no neutral way to sleep. Every pattern had meaning, and that meaning was always subject to judgment. The sleeping attire added yet another dimension of regulation. Nightgowns were supposed to be modest, covering the body completely from neck to wrist to ankles. They should be made of appropriate fabrics, cotton or linen for most of the year, flannel in winter. Some women continued wearing corsets to bed, as we mentioned before, either because they believed it was healthier or because they were trying to achieve or maintain a smaller waist. Sleeping in a corset meant interrupted, poor quality sleep. It meant waking up unable to breathe deeply. It meant being unable to roll over naturally or adjust your position comfortably. But the promise of a smaller waist, or the fear of being judged for having a larger one, motivated many women to endure this nightly discomfort. The bedroom itself was supposed to be set up in specific ways to promote proper rest. Windows should be slightly open for fresh air, but not so open that you might catch a chill. The room should be dark, but not completely so, as total darkness was thought to be unhealthy. The bed should be firm, not soft, as soft beds were believed to weaken the constitution. And if you shared a bedroom with a husband, there were rules about that too. Some Victorian advisors suggested that married couples should have separate bedrooms for health reasons. Others believed sharing a bedroom was proper, but that separate beds within the same room was ideal. The reasoning was that sleep required complete rest, and the presence of another person disturbed that rest. What this really meant, of course, was controlling when and how married couples engaged in sexual activity. If you had separate beds or separate rooms, intimacy became more scheduled, more deliberate, less spontaneous. This aligned with the Victorian beliefs that sexual activity should be infrequent and primarily for procreation, not pleasure. But many middle-class couples could not afford separate bedrooms or separate beds, so they navigated the tension between medical advice and practical reality. And women's quality of sleep suffered, because they were supposed to be available to their husbands, but also were blamed if they were tired during the day from disrupted nights. The expectations around sleep also varied by life stage. Pregnant women were given somewhat more leeway to rest as their condition was recognized as taxing. But new mothers with infants? They were expected to manage nighttime feedings and care while still appearing fresh and capable during the day. The exhaustion of early motherhood was acknowledged but not accommodated. Women were just supposed to cope. Older women past childbearing years were sometimes given more freedom in their sleep schedules, allowed to rest more during the day or retire earlier at night. But this freedom came with the implicit message that they were no longer socially valuable, that their primary purpose had been fulfilled, and they could now fade into the background. Throughout all of this, working-class women's sleep experiences were entirely different. They slept when they could, which was often not enough. Factory workers, domestic servants, farm labourers. These women had no control over their sleep schedules. They worked when they were told to work and slept in whatever hours remained, often in crowded, uncomfortable conditions. The sleep regulations, like all Victorian rest rules, were really for middle-class and upper-class women. They were another way of demonstrating status. You had the luxury of worrying about proper sleep position and appropriate napping times because your basic survival was not in question. But even within that privileged class, the rules around sleep created genuine suffering, chronic sleep deprivation, anxiety about rest, inability to listen to your body's actual needs. These took a toll on women's health and well-being. What strikes me most about Victorian sleep regulations is how they turned the most vulnerable, necessary human activity into another site of judgment and control. Sleep requires surrender. It requires trust that you will be safe while unconscious. For Victorian women, that safety was conditional. Even in sleep, they were being evaluated. And I think we still carry some of this anxiety. How many of us feel guilty about napping during the day? How many of us apologize if we admit we slept past a certain hour? How many of us feel like we should be able to function on less sleep, that needing rest is a kind of weakness? The Victorian rules may be gone, but the underlying message, that rest must be justified, that needing sleep reveals something negative about your character, that there are right and wrong ways to be unconscious, that message still echoes. Every time you allow yourself to nap without guilt, every time you sleep as late as your body needs, every time you honour your actual exhaustion instead of pushing through it, you're breaking free from Victorian expectations that try to control even the most basic biological needs. Sleep is not a luxury. It is not laziness. It is not something that needs to be earned or justified. It is a fundamental requirement of being alive. Victorian women knew this, even as they struggled against all the rules that made rest so difficult. And slowly, painfully, they helped change those rules so that future generations could rest more freely. Coming up next, we are going to explore how even conversation during rest time was controlled and monitored. The topics Victorian women could and could not discuss, the ways they were expected to speak and be beyond, and how constant self-censorship became another exhausting aspect of supposedly restful leisure time. But that exploration is just ahead. For now, rest if you need to, nap if you want to, sleep as much as your body needs. No one gets to judge you for being human anymore. Throughout this journey into Victorian rest, we have seen how every physical activity was controlled, how women sat, how they held needles, how they walked, how they slept. But perhaps the most insidious form of control was not over women's bodies at all. It was over their voices, their words, their ability to speak their own thoughts and experiences. Because Victorian society did not just regulate what women did during their rest time. It regulated what they could say, what topics were permitted, how much they could speak, and even the tone of voice they should use. And all of this was framed once again as concern for women's health and propriety during their leisure hours. The foundational rule appeared in nearly every etiquette manual of the era. A handbook of etiquette for ladies stated it plainly. It is better to say too little than too much in company. Let your conversation be consistent with your sex and age. Read that carefully. Your conversation should be consistent with your sex, not with your knowledge, not with your interests, not with your actual thoughts and feelings. With your sex, what did conversation consistent with being female sound like? Well, it was quiet, modest, never dominating, never controversial, never about yourself. Another etiquette guide from 1856 was even more explicit. Never introduce your own affairs for the amusement of the company. Such discussions cannot be interesting to others, and the probability is that the most patient listener is laying the foundation for some tale to make you appear ridiculous. Think about that for a moment. You could not talk about your own life, your own experiences, your own thoughts and feelings, because doing so would bore people and give them ammunition to mock you later. The message was clear. Your inner life is not interesting, not valuable, not worth discussing. Stay silent about yourself. So what could women talk about during their leisure time? The weather. Always say recent social events, as long as you spoke positively or neutrally. Mutual acquaintances, but only with kind words. Though we all know that gossip happened anyway, just disguised as concern. You could discuss books, but only appropriate ones. You could mention current events, but only lightly, never with strong opinions. And there were topics absolutely forbidden in polite female conversation. Politics was off limits. Religion, except in the most general and controversial terms, was dangerous. Money was vulgar. Anything to do with bodily functions, even in the most indirect terms, was completely unmentionable. Sex, of course, was absolutely taboo, but so was pregnancy, childbirth, menstruation, anything that acknowledged women had bodies that did things. One particularly telling prohibition comes from A Handbook of Etiquette for Ladies. Double entendre is detestable in a woman, especially when perpetrated in the presence of men. No man of taste can respect a woman who is guilty of it. Double entendre, any joke or comment with a subtle sexual meaning, was forbidden. Women were supposed to be so pure, so innocent, that they would not even understand such references, let alone make them. But here is the thing about that rule. It assumes that women were too innocent to understand innuendo. Yet every woman knew exactly what was being forbidden, which means they were not actually innocent at all. They were just required to perform innocence, to pretend they did not understand things they absolutely understood. This created an exhausting dynamic where women had to constantly monitor their words, censoring anything that might be interpreted as knowing or worldly. And they had to do this while appearing natural and spontaneous in conversation, because overly careful speech would suggest calculation rather than natural feminine modesty. The amount of mental energy required for this constant self-censorship is staggering. Imagine every conversation you have being filtered through multiple layers of, is this appropriate? Will this be judged? Does this make me seem too opinionated, too knowing, too interested in forbidden topics? And remember, this was during rest time, during leisure, during supposedly relaxing social interaction. Women developed strategies for navigating these restrictions. They learned to speak in indirect ways, to hint at things rather than state them directly. They became experts at coded language, where certain phrases meant one thing on the surface but communicated something else to those who understood the code. This allowed for more honest communication, but it was still exhausting and limiting. The restriction on talking about yourself was particularly damaging. It meant women could not share their struggles, could not seek advice or support for their problems, could not process their experiences through conversation. If you were unhappy in your marriage, you could not say so. If you were struggling with motherhood, you had to pretend everything was perfect. If you had ambitions beyond your prescribed role, you had to keep them hidden. This enforced silence about personal experience created terrible isolation. Women might sit together for hours making pleasant conversation about nothing important, while each of them was silently suffering through challenges they could not mention. The appearance of harmonious female companionship often masked deep loneliness, but the conversation rules went beyond just topic selection. They also governed how much women could speak. In mixed-gender company, women were expected to speak significantly less than men. If a man was speaking, women should listen attentively, never interrupting, showing interest through nods and appropriate facial expressions. One social observer in 1872 noted that in drawing room conversations, men spoke approximately 60 to 70% of the time, while women spoke 30 to 40%. Even when women outnumbered men in the gathering. This was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate training and social pressure that taught women to defer, to hold back, to let men dominate the conversational space. And when women did speak, the tone mattered as much as the content. A woman's voice should be pleasant, modulated, never too loud or too shrill. Passionate speech, raising your voice in excitement or emotion, was considered unladylike. Even laughter had rules. It should be light and musical, never loud guffaws or uncontrolled hilarity. Emily Thornwell's etiquette guide warned, "Loud laughter is unbecoming in a lady. Her mirth should be subdued to a smile, or at most a slight ripple of merriment." Your joy was supposed to be constrained, controlled, never fully expressed. Can you imagine living like this? Having something hilarious happen and having to compress your laughter into a slight smile, having a strong opinion about something important and having to phrase it so tentatively that no one takes it seriously, having experiences and feelings and thoughts and not being allowed to speak them. The psychological impact of this constant self-censorship was profound. Some women internalized it so completely that they genuinely believed their thoughts were not worth expressing, that their experiences were not interesting, that their role was to listen and reflect back, rather than to contribute their own ideas. Others chafed against it constantly, but had no outlet for their frustration. We have diary entries from Victorian women expressing anger and resentment at not being able to speak freely, at having to smile and nod while men said things they strongly disagreed with, at being silenced in their own homes and social circles. One particularly poignant diary entry from 1869 describes a dinner party where a male guest made factually incorrect statements about a topic the diarist knew well. She had studied it extensively, had read all the relevant literature, could have corrected him easily. But she stayed silent because contradicting a man in public would have been seen as aggressive and unfeminine. She wrote, "I sat there feeling my knowledge turn to poison in my throat, unable to speak, wondering what the point of learning anything is if I am never permitted to use that knowledge." That phrase, knowledge turning to poison, captures something essential about what conversation restrictions did to intelligent Victorian women. Their thoughts and insights, which could have enriched discussions and advanced understanding, were instead trapped inside them, becoming sources of frustration and bitterness rather than contribution and connection. But silence was not just about avoiding controversial topics or deferring to men. There was another layer of conversation control that was even more isolating. Victorian etiquette guides explicitly warned women against trusting other women with confidences. The Moral Encyclopedia advised, "Trust no female acquaintance, i.e., make no confidant of anyone." This extraordinary piece of advice essentially told women to have no close friendships, no intimate relationships where they could speak honestly and be truly known. The reasoning was that women were supposedly prone to gossip, that any secret shared would inevitably be spread. that female friendship was inherently unreliable. But the effect of this advice was to prevent women from forming the very support networks that might have helped them cope with their restricted lives. Some women ignored this advice, of course. They formed deep, intimate friendships where they could speak freely. These relationships were often the only spaces where women could be fully honest about their lives, their feelings, their thoughts. But the official guidance against female friendship meant that even these relationships had to be somewhat covert, maintained in private and downplayed in public. The conversation restrictions during rest time also varied by context. Formal afternoon calls required the most constrained conversation. Pleasant, superficial, brief, more intimate gatherings with close friends allowed slightly more freedom. But even there, certain topics remained off limits. Family dinners had their own dynamics, where women were expected to facilitate conversation among male family members rather than directing the discussion themselves. And in all these contexts, women were performing emotional labor that was invisible and unacknowledged. They were monitoring the mood of the room, asking questions that drew others out, smoothing over awkward moments, making sure everyone felt included and comfortable. This work was exhausting, but it was considered natural female behavior rather than skilled labor. One particularly insidious aspect of conversation control was how it prevented women from organizing collectively. If you cannot talk about politics, if you cannot discuss your own experiences, if you are warned against confiding in other women, how can you recognize shared problems? How can you organize for change? This was not accidental. The conversation rules served a political purpose. They kept women isolated from each other, unable to recognize that their individual struggles were actually systemic problems. When every woman believes she alone is unhappy, that her dissatisfaction is a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to unjust circumstances, collective action becomes impossible. But women found ways around this too. They communicated in writing, letters, diaries, eventually published essays and books where they could speak truths that were forbidden in conversation. They developed networks of female correspondence where ideas could be exchanged more freely than in face-to-face conversation governed by etiquette rules and in rare, precious spaces. Women's clubs, reading groups, charity organizations. Some women created environments where different conversation rules applied, where women could speak about politics, about social problems, about their own experiences. These spaces were revolutionary precisely because they allowed women to hear their own voices and each other's voices in ways that were forbidden elsewhere. The suffrage movement, the women's rights movement, the reform movements of the late Victorian era, all of these grew out of spaces where women were allowed to talk to each other honestly. Once women could speak freely and listen to each other, once they could recognize their shared experiences and collective power, change became possible. But for most of the Victorian era, most women spent most of their time in conversational environments where their voices were tightly controlled, where rest and leisure time meant sitting quietly, speaking little, saying nothing important, revealing nothing personal, and performing cheerful contentment regardless of what they actually felt. The modern parallels are uncomfortable to recognize. How often do women still moderate their speech to avoid seeming aggressive or opinionated? How often do we phrase our statements as questions to seem less threatening? How often do we laugh at jokes we do not find funny or stay silent when we disagree because speaking up will be awkward or difficult? The Victorian rules are gone, but the patterns they created linger. Women are still interrupted more than men in meetings. Women's contributions are still sometimes overlooked or credited to men. Women who speak with confidence and authority are still sometimes labelled as aggressive or unlikable. And we still do not always have permission to speak honestly about our experiences. Topics like miscarriage, mental health struggles, workplace discrimination, domestic violence, These are more speakable now than they were in Victorian times, but they are still often met with discomfort, with suggestions that such things should be discussed privately, with social pressure to maintain a positive public face. What the Victorian conversation rules teach us is that controlling speech is a powerful form of control overall. When you cannot name your experience, when you cannot speak your truth, when you cannot even articulate your thoughts to yourself because you have been trained to censor them before they fully form, you are profoundly disempowered, and the reverse is also true. Every time women speak honestly about their experiences, every time we name injustices, every time we refuse to be silent about things that matter, we are claiming power. We are breaking free from Victorian constraints that tried to keep us voiceless. The women who wrote the forbidden novels, who published under pseudonyms, who kept honest diaries that they knew would be shocking if discovered, who whispered truths to each other in stolen private moments, they were all fighting for the right to have a voice. And their courage made it possible for us to speak more freely now. Coming up next, we're going to explore one more arena of Victorian control over women's rest, the diary dilemma. How even private writing, even the thoughts women recorded for themselves alone, were monitored and policed, because apparently even your most private thoughts were subject to regulation in Victorian society. But we will turn those pages shortly. For now, speak your truth. Say what matters to you, your voice is valuable, your thoughts are worth expressing, and no etiquette manual gets to tell you otherwise anymore. If conversation with others was controlled, monitored, and censored, you might think that at least in the privacy of their own minds, in the pages of their personal diaries, Victorian women could finally be free, finally honest, finally themselves without performance or judgment. And many women did turn to diary keeping as a refuge, a space where they could write the thoughts they could never speak aloud. But even this most private form of expression was not truly private. Even here, in what should have been the sanctuary of their own thoughts, Victorian women faced surveillance, judgment, and the very real possibility that their words would be discovered and used against them. Diary keeping was actively encouraged for Victorian women, but, and this is crucial, only certain kinds of diary keeping. The approved diary was a record of moral improvement, a place to note spiritual reflections, to express gratitude, to document household activities and social obligations. It was supposed to make you a better woman, not to express discontent with being a woman. Religious and moral guides often recommended that young women keep what they called spiritual journals, where they could track their progress toward becoming more pious, more obedient, more resigned to God's will. One popular guide from 1862 suggested that girls should write daily entries examining their behavior for signs of vanity, selfishness, or willfulness, and committing to do better. This was diary keeping as self-surveillance. You were supposed to monitor yourself, judge yourself, and record your failures to live up to impossible standards. The diary became another tool of control, making women internalize the critical voices that surrounded them in daily life. But of course, many women used their diaries differently. They wrote honestly about their frustrations, their desires, their anger, their secret thoughts. And when those diaries were discovered, and they often were, the consequences could be severe. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed in Victorian households. Servants cleaned rooms and had access to personal spaces. Family members felt entitled to read each other's correspondence and papers. Locks on bedroom furniture were sometimes removed by fathers or husbands who believed they had the right to know everything about the women in their household. This meant that keeping a diary required constant vigilance. Where could you hide it where no one would find it? When could you write in it without being observed? What should you do with it when you travelled or when guests stayed in your room? And always, always, the awareness that it might be found and read. Some women developed elaborate hiding systems, diaries tucked between mattresses, sewn into the linings of furniture, hidden in boxes with false bottoms. One woman's memoir from the 1890s describes keeping her diary inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf, disguised as a volume of sermons that she knew no one would ever actually open. Others wrote in code developing personal systems of abbreviation and substitution that would make their entries incomprehensible to anyone else. Some used multiple languages, switching to French or Latin for particularly sensitive passages, knowing that their mothers or sisters might not be able to read those sections. And many women practiced what one scholar calls pre-censorship. They wrote their diaries already anticipating that they might be read. They edited their thoughts as they wrote them, leaving out the most dangerous feelings, the most forbidden desires, the most honest assessments of their lives. Even in this supposedly private space, they could not be fully free. The fear of discovery was well-founded. We have multiple accounts of diaries being found and destroyed. One particularly heartbreaking story comes from a woman whose diary was discovered by her father in 1875. She had written honestly about her unhappiness with the marriage her parents were arranging for her, about her desire to attend university instead, about her frustration with her limited options. Her father burned the entire diary in the fireplace while she watched, and then forbade her from keeping another. In her later memoir, written decades after, she described watching her thoughts and feelings turn to ash, feeling like part of herself was being destroyed. She never kept another diary, and she married the man her father chose. Her voice, even in private, had been silenced. Another account from 1883 describes a husband who regularly read his wife's diary without her knowledge. He discovered that she had written about feeling lonely in their marriage, about missing her unmarried friends who had more intellectual freedom. He confronted her angrily, accusing her of being ungrateful and disloyal. She stopped writing honestly in her diary after that, using it only to record social engagements and household tasks. The one space where she had been able to be honest became another performance. This surveillance of private writing was not just about individual family members being intrusive. It was part of a broader cultural belief that women did not have a right to privacy, that their thoughts and feelings were subject to oversight by male authority figures who supposedly knew better what was good for them. Some etiquette guides made this explicit. They suggested that fathers should occasionally read their daughters' diaries to ensure they were developing appropriate thoughts and attitudes. Husbands were advised to be aware of what their wives were writing, to guard against them developing improper attachments or discontent with their station. The diary was supposed to be a tool of self-improvement, and that improvement needed to be monitored to ensure it was happening correctly. The idea that a woman might have private thoughts that were none of anyone else's business was not widely accepted. But here is what I find fascinating. Despite all this surveillance, despite all the risks, women kept writing. They kept creating private spaces for their thoughts, even when those spaces were constantly under threat. The human need for self-expression, for recording one's own experience, for having a voice even if only on paper. That need was strong enough that women risked discovery and punishment to fulfill it. And the diaries that survived, that were hidden well enough or cherished by sympathetic descendants, give us an invaluable window into Victorian women's actual experiences. The public-facing documents from the era, the etiquette manuals, the advice literature, the sermons, tell us what women were supposed to think and feel, but the diaries tell us what they actually thought and felt. We learn from these diaries that many women were desperately unhappy, that they questioned the restrictions placed on them, that they resented being treated as intellectual and moral children well into adulthood, that they had ambitions that went far beyond the domestic sphere, that they loved each other in ways that defied easy categorization, that they were angry, passionate, intelligent, complex human beings forced into a very narrow mould. Some of the most revealing diary entries are the ones where women wrote about the diary keeping itself. One woman wrote in 1878, "I know I should not write these thoughts, that if anyone read them I would be thought a monster, but if I do not write them they will consume me from the inside. So I write and I hide these pages, and I hope that someday, perhaps when I'm dead and it no longer matters, someone will read them and know that I existed, that I felt, that I was more than what I seemed." That passage breaks my heart. The idea that she could only be fully known after her death, that authentic existence was something that had to be postponed until it was safe. What a tragic way to live. But not all diary discoveries ended badly. Some women deliberately arranged for their diaries to be published after their deaths, wanting their experiences to be known. Some daughters and granddaughters published their mothers' and grandmothers' diaries, recognizing the historical value of these honest accounts. And some women, particularly toward the end of the Victorian era as women's rights movements gained strength, began publishing their diaries or fictionalized versions of them while still alive. They used personal writing as a form of political activism, showing the reality of women's lives in contrast to the idealized versions presented in popular culture. The most famous example of this is probably Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, which we have discussed before. It is fiction, but it is based so closely on her own diary entries about her experience with the rest cure that it reads as memoir. She published it to expose the cruelty of that treatment, using her private suffering as evidence in a public argument. Other women published their travel diaries, their household accounts, their observations of social conditions. They took the private female form of the diary and made it public, claiming space in literary and political discourse. But for every diary that was preserved or published, countless others were destroyed. Women burned their own diaries as they aged, not wanting them to be found after death. Families destroyed diaries they considered embarrassing or inappropriate. Fires, floods, and simple neglect claimed others. We have lost so many voices, so many honest accounts of what it was like to be a Victorian woman, to navigate all the rules and restrictions we have discussed in this series. The diaries that survive are precious partly because we know how many did not. The content that was forbidden in diaries tells us a lot about what Victorian society most wanted to control in women. Anger was forbidden. You should not write angry words about your husband, your father, your limited options. Anger in women was considered unnatural and disturbing. Ambition was forbidden. You should not write about wanting more than domestic life, about envying men's opportunities, about feeling that you were capable of things you were not allowed to attempt. Sexuality was absolutely forbidden. Any acknowledgement that you had sexual feelings, desires, or experiences, even with your own husband, was considered shocking if written down. The ideal woman was supposed to be passively receptive to her husband's attentions, but to have no desires of her own. And the deepest, most dangerous thing to write was doubt. Doubt about whether the system was fair. Doubt about whether the restriction served any real purpose. Doubt about whether women were actually the delicate, emotional, irrational creatures they were told they were. Because once you started doubting, once you started questioning, the entire structure became unstable. And diary keeping, for all its risks, was a space where some women allowed themselves to doubt and question in ways they never could in conversation. One particularly striking diary entry from 1871 reads, "Today in church the minister spoke about women's proper submission and how our suffering brings us closer to Christ. I bowed my head as expected, but in my heart I wondered, if God made me with a mind, why would he forbid me to use it? If my suffering serves no purpose but to demonstrate my virtue, is that not wasteful? These are sinful thoughts, I know, but I cannot stop thinking them no matter how I pray." These questions, written in their private, anticipate the arguments that the women's rights movement would make public decades later. The personal is political, as later feminists would say. The private doubts women expressed in their diaries were the seeds of collective action. The practice of diary keeping also created a kind of community across time. Women would read their mothers' or grandmothers' diaries and recognize their own struggles. They would see that the feelings they thought were uniquely shameful or wrong were actually shared across generations. This could be both comforting and enraging. Comforting to know you were not alone. Enraging to see that the same problems had persisted for so long. Modern women still keep diaries, of course, though. Now they are as likely to be digital as handwritten. And we face new versions of old questions about privacy. Who might read our emails, our texts, our social media posts? What should we keep truly private, and what can we share publicly? The difference is that now, at least in theory, we have legal protection for our privacy. Our husbands and fathers do not have the right to read our private communications. We can lock our devices and our accounts. The surveillance still exists, from tech companies, from governments, from hackers, but family members reading our diaries without permission would now be considered a violation, not an entitled right. Still, many of us practice forms of self-censorship that would be familiar to Victorian women. We write things and then delete them before posting. We keep our most honest thoughts in private journals that we hide or protect. We worry about how our words would be received if the wrong person saw them. The Victorian diary dilemma asks us to consider what we lose when we cannot speak or write freely. What does it do to a person to constantly censor their own thoughts? What happens when the most authentic version of yourself can only exist in secret, hidden away where you hope no one will find it? And it also shows us the courage it takes to write honestly anyway, to claim the right to have a voice, even if that voice can only speak on private pages, to insist that your thoughts and feelings matter enough to be recorded, even if you have to hide the record. Every Victorian woman who kept an honest diary, who risked discovery to write her truth, was performing an act of resistance. She was claiming that her inner life was real and valuable regardless of what society said. And many of them were writing for us, for future readers they hoped would someday care about their experiences. When we read those surviving diaries now, we honour that hope. We tell those long-dead women that yes, your life mattered. Your thoughts were valuable, your voice deserves to be heard. We are listening across the years, and we recognise you as fully human, fully complex, fully worthy of being known. In our final part, we are going to bring all of this together. We are going to look at the women who rejected these rules, who found ways to break free, and what their resistance teaches us about rest, freedom, and what it means to reclaim your own life. But that conclusion is coming up next. For now, write what is true for you. Record your real thoughts and feelings. You have the right to exist fully on the page, not just the parts that are acceptable to others. We have travelled through 11 parts of this story together, exploring all the ways Victorian society tried to control women's rest. The needlework that was not restful, the books they could not read, the horrifying rest cure, the posture that hurt, the social calls that exhausted, the music that created anxiety, the exercise that was forbidden, the sleep that was monitored, the conversation that was censored, the private thoughts that were not truly private. It is a catalogue of control so comprehensive, so relentless, that you might wonder how anyone survived it with their spirit intact. And the truth is, many did not. Many Victorian women lived and died within these constraints, never experiencing what real rest feels like, never knowing the freedom of being fully themselves. But some women said no. Some women looked at all these rules and restrictions and decided they were done performing, done pretending, done sacrificing their authentic selves on the altar of respectability, and these women, the rebels, the resistors, the ones who broke free, they changed the world. Let us start with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose story we have returned to several times throughout this journey. In 1887, after her disastrous experience with Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's rest cure, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable for most women of her era. She left her husband. She moved across the country with her young daughter. She began working and writing full-time, supporting herself through her own labour. This was scandalous. Divorces were rare and carried enormous social stigma. A woman who left her husband was often considered morally suspect, unfit for respectable society. And Gilman did not just leave quietly, she wrote about it. She published The Yellow Wallpaper in 1892, exposing the cruelty of the rest cure. She wrote feminist essays and gave lectures arguing for women's economic independence. She became intentionally and publicly everything Victorian society said women should not be, and she described this choice as literally saving her life. In her autobiography, published in 1935, she wrote about the moment she rejected Mitchell's advice to never write again. I cast the noted specialist's advice to the winds and went to work again, ultimately recovering some measure of power. She chose work over rest, honesty over propriety, freedom over acceptance. And she found healing in that choice, not in the enforced rest that had nearly destroyed her. Gilman was not alone. The late Victorian era and early 20th century saw a growing movement of women who rejected the entire framework of feminine restriction. They called themselves the New Woman, and they represented a fundamental challenge to everything Victorian society believed about gender and rest. The New Woman worked outside the home. She pursued higher education. She participated in sports and wore practical clothing that allowed movement. She rode bicycles without caring what doctors said about moral corruption. She spoke her mind in public. She demanded the right to vote, to own property, to control her own earnings. She refused to accept that women were naturally delicate, naturally domestic, naturally in need of male supervision. In 1894, the novelist Sarah Grand published an essay defining the New Woman, writing, "We are awaking from our long apathy, and the New Woman is essentially awake." That word, awake, is powerful. The Victorian rest rules were designed to keep women in a kind of sleep, passive and controlled. The New Woman chose consciousness, awareness, agency. The backlash against the New Woman was fierce and often hysterical. Medical authorities published papers warning that education and work would damage women's reproductive systems. Popular magazines ran cartoons mocking new women as mannish and unattractive. Ministers preached that women who rejected their natural role would face divine punishment. One particularly telling attack came from an 1806 medical journal, where a doctor warned that new women who pursued careers and refused to focus on domestic duties were creating a race suicide by choosing not to have children or having fewer children. The language of racial and national decline was deployed to try to force women back into compliance. But it did not work. Women kept choosing freedom over approval. They kept insisting that their lives should be more than decorative rest in service of male comfort. Think about what this required. These women faced real consequences. They were ostracized from polite society. Their families sometimes disowned them. They had trouble finding work because many professions were closed to women. They faced public mockery and private condemnation, and they did it anyway. One woman who exemplifies this courage is Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain in 1865. She faced enormous obstacles. Medical schools refused to admit her. so she had to study privately. The Society of Apothecaries tried to change their rules to prevent other women from following her path. Male doctors refused to work with her, but she persisted. She opened a dispensary for women and children. She fought for women's access to medical education. And when asked why she would subject herself to such difficulty, she said simply, "I had no choice. The work needed to be done, and I could do it." That phrase, "I could do it," is a radical statement for a Victorian woman. It asserts capability, agency, the right to use your abilities regardless of what society says is proper for your sex. Or consider the women who participated in the suffrage movement, particularly the militant suffragettes in the early 20th century. These women engaged in civil disobedience, chaining themselves to railings, breaking windows, going on hunger strikes when imprisoned. They were force-fed, brutalized, publicly shamed, and they kept fighting. One suffragette, Emmeline Pankhurst, famously said in 1913, "We are here, not because we are lawbreakers, we are here in our efforts to become lawmakers." She reframed resistance as responsibility, arguing that breaking unjust laws was necessary to create just ones. These women understood something crucial, that all the Victorian rest rules, all the restrictions on women's bodies and voices and thoughts, were not really about health or morality. They were about power, about keeping women powerless. And the only way to change that was to refuse compliance. But we should also honour the quieter forms of resistance, the women who did not make headlines but who carved out small freedoms in their daily lives. The woman who read forbidden novels hidden in her sewing basket. The woman who walked just a little further than was proper. The woman who wrote honestly in her diary despite the risks. The woman who laughed too loudly at something genuinely funny and did not apologize. These acts might seem trivial compared to civil disobedience and political organizing, but they mattered. Every small refusal, every tiny claim of autonomy was practice for larger freedoms. And collectively, these individual acts of resistance created a culture where change became possible. The transformation did not happen overnight. World War I played a significant role, forcing society to acknowledge that women could do physically demanding work, could make decisions, could function without constant male supervision. When women successfully ran farms, factories and hospitals while men were at war, it became harder to argue that they were too delicate for such responsibilities. The 1920s brought dramatic changes in women's fashion, moving away from corsets and restrictive clothing toward more comfortable, practical styles. Women cut their hair short. They wore skirts that allowed them to move freely. They danced and smoked and drove cars. These changes in how women inhabited their bodies reflected deeper changes in how women understood themselves. But we need to be honest about the limits of this progress. The women who gained the most freedom were white middle-class women. Working-class women and women of colour faced continued restrictions, often different ones but no less oppressive. The story of women's liberation is not a simple upward arc, but a complicated, ongoing struggle with victories and setbacks. And some of the Victorian anxieties about women's rest persist in new forms. We may not have the rest cure anymore, but we have wellness culture that often functions as another way to control women's time and bodies. We may not have mandatory needlework, but we have the expectation that women will engage in emotional labour that is exhausting but invisible. The question of what real rest looks like for women is still not fully answered, because rest requires safety, and many women still do not feel safe in their bodies, in their homes, in public spaces. Rest requires freedom from judgment, and women are still judged constantly for their choices. Rest requires the ability to listen to your own needs, and women are still trained to prioritize everyone else's needs first. But here is what I find hopeful. Every generation of women has learned from the resistance of the previous generation. Charlotte Perkins Gilman inspired women in the early 20th century. Those women inspired the feminists of the 1960s and 70s. They inspired the activists of today. The work continues, building on itself, moving toward a world where women can truly rest. And rest, real rest, is revolutionary. It always has been. In a system designed to keep you constantly productive, constantly available, constantly performing, choosing to stop, to be still, to honor your own exhaustion, that is resistance. In a culture that tells you your worth depends on what you produce, on how you serve others, on how well you conform to expectations, claiming the right to rest without earning it first, without justifying it, without apologizing for it, that is radical. Every time you rest without guilt, you are honoring the women who fought for that right. Every time you speak honestly about your experiences, you are using the freedom that other women sacrificed to create. Every time you move your body for joy rather than obligation, every time you read what you want, every time you let your hands be empty and your mind be quiet, you are living the freedom Victorian women dreamed of. So rest, really rest. Not the productive rest that Victorian society demanded, where you are still working even while sitting still. Not the rest that serves someone else's agenda or meets someone else's expectations, just rest. Your body's rest, your mind's rest, your soul's rest. You have permission. You always had permission, actually, because you are a human being, and rest is a human need. But in case you needed to hear it from someone else, you have permission to stop performing, to stop proving, to stop earning the right to exist comfortably in your own body. The Victorian women who came before you, who lived under all those impossible rules, who found small moments of freedom where they would want this for you. They fought so that you would not have to live the way they did. Honor that fight by actually resting, by actually being free. As we close this journey through Victorian rest rules, I want to thank you for listening, for staying with me through all the 12 parts of this story, for caring about these women whose lives were so restricted, whose struggles feel distant and yet somehow still familiar. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself recognizing patterns in your own life, if you learned something or felt something, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Where are you watching from? Which part of this Victorian rest story surprised you most? What rules do you think we still carry with us today? And if you found value in this exploration, please share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. These stories of women's resistance and resilience need to be told and retold. They remind us where we came from and how much has changed. They also remind us how much work remains. The story of women and rest is not finished. It continues in your life, in my life, in the lives of women everywhere who are still navigating expectations about productivity, about worthiness, about what it means to be properly feminine. The struggle for genuine rest, for true freedom, for the right to be fully human, that struggle is ongoing. But tonight, right now, you can rest. You have earned it simply by being alive. And I hope, after hearing this story, you can rest a little more freely, knowing that the chains Victorian women wore have been loosened, if not entirely broken. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And please come back soon for more strange history, more forgotten stories, more journeys into the past that illuminate the present. Until then, rest well, sleep deeply, and remember, you are free in ways your ancestors could only dream of. Use that freedom wisely. Good night.